Chapter 13 of Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in July 2022. Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport. Chapter 13. Attempt to steal the Regalia from the Tower. First opening of the Regalia to public inspection. Edward's appointed keeper. Plan formed by Blood to steal the Regalia. He visits the Tower with his pretended wife. Means by which he contrived to become intimate with Edwards. His arrangements for carrying his scheme into execution. He knocks down Edwards and obtains possession of the jewels. Fortunate chance by which his scheme was frustrated. He is taken. Charles II is present at his examination. Blood contrives to obtain a pardon and the gift of an estate from the king. Bailey, in his History of the Tower of London, has very circumstantially related the attempt made by a desperado named Blood to steal the Regalia from thence. Though it failed in the execution, this scheme was most ingeniously planned. The subsequent ingenuity of the culprit, on his examination before the king, also saved him from a just punishment, and not only procured him pardon for his offence, but even a handsome reward in the form of an annuity. Soon after the appointment of Sir Giles Talbot to the office of Master of the Jewel House in the Tower, the Regalia first became the object of public inspection. The privilege of showing them was granted by Charles II to the keeper, in consequence of certain reductions in the emoluments of the office. The person appointed to take charge of them was a confidential servant named Talbot Edwards, and soon after, in 1673, the attempt of the notorious Blood was made. 3 weeks before the execution of his plan, Blood went to the Tower, in the canonical habit of a clergyman, accompanied by a woman whom he called his wife. They desired to see the Regalia, and just as their wishes had been gratified, the lady feigned indisposition. This circumstance called forth the kind offices of Mrs. Edwards, who courteously invited her into the dwelling-house. The lady, however, soon recovered, and, on departing, professed great gratitude. A few days after this, Blood came again, bringing Mrs. Edwards 4 pair of white gloves as a present from his pretended wife. This civility opened a way to a more intimate acquaintance, and, at length, Blood offered a proposal of marriage between his nephew, whom he represented as possessing £200 per annum in land, and Miss Edwards, if agreeable to all parties, on a longer acquaintance. A treaty was entered into, and the young gentleman was to come in a day or 2 to be presented. At the time appointed, Blood went with 3 others to the jewel house, armed with rapier blades in their canes, and everyone had a dagger and a brace of pistols. 2 of the friends, to fill up the time whilst the daughter was adorning herself, expressed a wish to view the Regalia before dinner, and it was arranged that, together with Blood, they should accompany old Mr. Edwards for that purpose, whilst the anxious lover should wait below for the coming of his mistress, but in reality to watch lest interruption should take place. When the 3 had entered with Edwards into the room, a cloak was thrown over him, a gag was placed in his mouth, and he was threatened with death if he made the least noise. But, as he was not intimidated, and made attempts to sound an alarm, he was silenced by some blows on the head with a mallet, and a stab in the belly, when he lay as if dead. They then proceeded to secrete the booty about their persons. One of them, named Parrot, put the orb into his pocket, Blood held the crown under his cloak, and the third was about to file the sceptre into 2 pieces, to place it in a bag, when fortunately the son of Mr. Edwards visited the father, and, regardless of the opposition made by the watchful pretended lover, persisted to force his way in. The scuffle below was heard, and this unexpected incident, spreading confusion among them, they instantly decamped, leaving the sceptre undivided. The aged keeper, recovering, forced the gag from his mouth, and cried, "Treason!" The alarm was given, and parties were sent to the several gates to stop them. They escaped, however, out at St. Catherine's Gate, where horses were waiting for them, but were speedily overtaken. Under Blood's cloak was found the crown, and, even when a prisoner, he had the impudence to struggle for his prize, and said it was a gallant attempt, however unsuccessful, as it was for a crown. In the struggle the great pearl and a large diamond, with a few smaller jewels, were lost from the crown, but fortunately they were afterwards found and restored. Blood being carried before Sir Gilbert Talbot, the king went to hear his examination and confession. This was a fortunate circumstance for the culprit, who artfully worked at once on the vanity and the apprehensions of the monarch. He told him that he had formerly been engaged with others to kill his majesty while he was bathing at Battersea, and had concealed himself in the reeds to effect this purpose, but that, when he had taken aim, the awe inspired by the royal presence unnerved his hand, and he desisted from his sanguinary design. He added that he was but one of 300, who were sworn to revenge each other's fall, that the king might do with him as he pleased, but that, by dooming him to suffer, he would endanger his own life and the lives of his advisers, while, on the contrary, by displaying clemency, he would win the gratitude and the services of a band of fearless and faithful followers. Either won over by the boldness and candour of the ruffian, or alarmed by his threats, Charles not only pardoned Blood, but likewise gave him an estate in Ireland, worth £500 a year. Poor Edwards, who suffered severely from his injuries, was less fortunate. He only had a grant of £200, and his son 100, and even of these trifling sums the payment was so long deferred that they were obliged to sell the orders at half price for ready money. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport. Vampyrism. Horrible nature of the superstition of vampirism. Persons attacked by vampires become vampires themselves. Signs by which a vampire was known. Origin of one of the signs. Effect attributed to excommunication in the Greek Church. Story of an excommunicated Greek. Kalmat's theory of the origin of the superstition respecting vampires. Saint Stanislaus. Philinium. The Strigus supposed to have given the idea of the vampire. Capitulary of Charlemagne. Remedy against attacks from the demon. Anecdote of an impudent vampire. Story of a vampire at Mycenae. Prevalence of vampirism in the north of Europe. Wallachian mode of detecting vampires. Among the many superstitions which have terrified and degraded mankind, that which has received the name vampirism is, perhaps, the most horrible and loathsome. The vampire, or bloodsucker, has been forcibly described as a corporeal creature of blood and unquenchable bloodthirst, a ravenous corpse who rises in body and soul from his grave for the sole purpose of glutting his sanguinary appetite with the lifeblood of those whose blood stagnates in his own veins. He is endowed with an incorruptible frame to prey upon the lives of his kindred and his friends. He reappears among them from the world of the tomb, not to tell its secrets of joy or of woe, nor to invite or to warn by the testimony of his experience, but to appall and assassinate those who were dearest to him on earth, and this not for the gratification of revenge or any human feeling, which, however depraved, might find something in common with human nature, but to banquet a monstrous thirst, acquired in the tomb, and which, though he walks in human form and human lineaments, has swallowed up every human motive in its brutal ferocity. It is manifest that a being of this kind must be infinitely more terrible than the common race of ghosts, spectres, and fiendish visitants. But there was another circumstance which inexpressibly heightened the horror excited by the dread of being attacked. Wasting illness, closed by death, was not all that the victim had to endure. He who was sucked by a vampire was doomed to become, in his turn, a member of the hideous community, and to inflict on others, even on those who were nearest and dearest to him, the same evils by which he had himself suffered and perished. When a grave was opened in order to search for one of these pests to put a stop to his career, the sanguinary offender was recognized by the corpse being fresh and well preserved, the eyes open or half closed, the face a vermilion hue, the limbs flexible, the hair and nails long, and the pulse beating. The idea of this unchanged state of the corpse seems to have originated from a superstition of the Greek Church. It was believed that excommunication, inflicted by Greek priests, had the power of preventing the lifeless remains of the excommunicated person from sinking into decay. An instance of this effect being produced is mentioned in Ricaute in his History of the Greek Church. A young man, Milos, who had been put under an ecclesiastical ban, was buried in a remote and unconsecrated ground. He became a vampire, or, as the modern Greeks term it, a roukolaka. The corpse was disinterred and displayed all the signs of vampirism. The priests were about to treat it as was usual in such cases, but the friends of the deceased solicited and obtained a cessation of hostilities till a messenger could be sent to Constantinople to pray for absolution from the patriarch. The corpse, meanwhile, was placed in the church, and masses were daily and nightly said. One day, while the priest was reading the service, a crash was heard from the coffin. The lid was opened, and the body was found as entirely decayed as though it had been buried for 7 years. When the messenger arrived with the absolution, it was ascertained that the patriarch had affixed his signature to it at the exact moment when the crash was heard in the coffin. The superstition relative to vampires is supposed by Calmet to be derived from ancient legends. The first of these legends is the story of St. Stanislaus raising a man who had been dead 3 years, and whom he had called to life that he might give evidence in the saint's behalf in a court of justice. After having given his testimony, the resuscitated man returned quietly to his grave. A second is to be found in Phlegon de Mirabilibus, who relates that a girl of the name of Philinium, a native of Tralles in Asia Minor, not only visited, ate, drank with her lover after her death, but even cohabited with him. But in neither of these cases do we find a trace of the diabolical malignity which characterizes the vampire. A more congenial origin may perhaps be found in the strigus, of which Ovid makes mention, and this origin appears the more probable when we consider that, in the Middle Ages, the strigus had an established place among the demon tribe, and, in the shape of the suspected males and females, was often burnt, among other sorcerers and magicians, by the Lombards and Germans. There is extant a capitulary of Charlemagne, which shows how prevalent the belief was in the existence of the strigus, and how strong a resemblance the fiend bore to the vampire of modern times. It enacts that if any person deceived by the devil shall believe, after the manner of the pagans, that any man or woman was a strigus or strix, and was given to eat men, and for this cause should burn such person, or should give such person's flesh to be eaten, or should eat such flesh, such man or woman should be capitally punished. From the capitulary it is clear that eating flesh of the delinquent strix was supposed to be a remedy for the evils which the demon inflicted. There is a somewhat similar circumstance connected with the vampire, which strengthens the idea that it is a legitimate descendant of the strix. In a French work, published nearly a century and a half ago, is an account of the oupires, or vampires, which infested Poland and Russia. They appear, says the author, from midday to midnight, and suck the blood of men and beasts in such abundance that it often issues again out of the mouth, nose, and ears, and the corpse sometimes is found swimming in the blood with which its cerecloth is filled. This redivive, or oupire, or some demon in his form, rises from the tombs, goes by night to hug and squeeze violently his relations or friends, and sucks their blood, so as to weaken and exhaust them, and at length occasion their death. This persecution is not confined to a single person, but extends throughout the family, unless it is arrested by cutting off the head or opening the heart of the upir, which they find in its cerecloth soft, flexible, tumid, and ruddy, although long ago dead. A large quantity of blood commonly flows from the body, which some mix up with flour and make bread of it. And this bread, when eaten, is found to preserve them from the vexation of the spectre. It is singular, however, that though the vampire himself might thus be rendered edible, he was imagined to communicate an infectious quality to whatever he fed on, so that if anyone were unlucky enough to eat the flesh of cattle which had been sucked, he would, after death, be sure to become a member of the blood-sucking fraternity. In one part of his statement, this author is incorrect. Vampires were not so easily got rid of as he imagined. Nothing short of burning would, at least in the majority of cases, put an end to their diabolical visitations. Some of them had the audacity to make a jest of driving a stake through them. Of this class was a peasant of the village of Blois, in Bohemia, who had long been most mischievous and active. Quote, "At last they dug him up and drove a stake through him, during which he had the impudence to laugh and jeer at his executioners, and thank them for giving him a stick to defend himself against the dogs. This procedure did not answer at all. He became still more troublesome than ever. Then they delivered him over to the hangman, who placed him in a cart to carry him out of the village and burn him. But in this new situation he kicked and struggled like a man in a frenzy, and when they again drove stakes into him, uttered loud shrieks, and gave a large quantity of fine, healthy blood. At last they burnt him, and the village at the moment ceased to be infested as before." End quote. The belief in vampirism prevailed in Greece, where, as we have already stated, the demon was known by the name Roucolica or Brucoculus. Tournefort relates an amusing story of one that woefully annoyed the inhabitants of Mycenae. Prayers, processions, stabbing with swords, sprinklings of holy water, and even pouring it in large doses down the throat of the refractory Roucolica were all tried in vain. An Albanian who chanced to be at Messene objected to 2 of these remedies. It was no wonder that the devil continued in, he said, for how could he possibly come through the holy water? As to the swords, they were equally effectual in preventing his exit, for, their handles being crosses, he was so much terrified that he dared not pass them. To obviate the latter objection, he recommended that Turkish scimitars should be used. The scimitars were accordingly put in requisition, but the pertinacious devil still retained his hold of the corpse, and played his pranks with as much vigor as ever. At length, when all the respectable inhabitants were packing up to take flight to Syra or Tinos, an effectual mode of ousting the Roucolica was fortunately suggested. The body was committed to the flames on the 1st of January, 1701. And the spirit, being thus forcibly ejected from his abode, was rendered incapable of doing further mischief. He, however, left behind him a legacy of vexation to the Mycenaeans, for, as a punishment for having had doings with the evil one, a fine was imposed upon them by the Turks when they next visited the island to receive the capitation tax. But though vampirism was known in Greece, it was far more prevalent in Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia, Poland, Hungary, and Wallachia. In those countries, it raged particularly from 1725 to 1735. There was scarcely a village that was not said to be haunted by one of the blood-sucking demons, and the greatest part of the population was a prey to the terror. The belief was not confined to the vulgar. All classes participated in it. Military and ecclesiastical commissions were appointed to investigate the facts, and the press teemed with dissertations and narratives from the pens of erudite individuals whose learning was at least equaled by their inveterate credulity. The mode which was employed by the Wallachians for the detection of vampires, there is a touch of the romantic. On a jet-black horse, which had never approached the female, they mounted a young boy, and made them pass up and down the churchyard by all the graves, and wherever the animal refused to proceed, they concluded that particular grave to be inhabited by a vampire. They then open it, says the narrator, and find within it a corpse equally fat and fair as a man who is quietly sleeping. By cutting off the head and filling up the trench, all danger was removed, and those who had been attacked were gradually restored to their strength and faculties. End of Chapter 14. Read by Lindsay Strausser, Jacksonville, August 2022.
Chapter 15 of Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport. Chapter 15, Juggling. Feats of jugglers formerly attributed to witchcraft. Anglo-Saxon gleemen. Norman jugglers or trigators. Chaucer's description of the wonders performed by them. Means probably employed by them. Recipe for making the appearance of a flood. Jugglers fashionable in the reign of Charles II. Evelyn's account of a fire-eater. Catafelto. Superiority of Asiatic and Egyptian pretenders to magical skill. Mandeville's account of juggling at the court of the Great Khan. Extraordinary feats witnessed by the Emperor Jehangir. Ibn Battuta's account of Hindustani jugglers. Account of a Brahmin who sat upon the air. Egyptian jugglers. Mr. Lane's account of the performance of one of them. Another fails in satisfying Captain Scott. The mountebanks who now exhibit on the travelling stage or cart, and whose buffoonery pleases only the clown, were formerly thought to practise witchcraft, or deal with some unlawful powers. The jolocators, jugglers, or trigators of the Normans were men of much higher pretensions than the gleemen. Some of the delusions which they practise could not have been performed without considerable scientific knowledge. We have the authority of Chaucer for the fact that they cheated the eyes with blear illusion, in a manner which may excuse ignorant spectators for having attributed the effect to supernatural means. In a large hall they will, says he, produce water with boats rowed up and down upon it. Sometimes they will bring in the similitude of a grim lion, or make flowers spring up in a meadow. Sometimes they cause a vine to flourish, bearing white and red grapes, or show a castle built with stone, and when they please they cause the whole to disappear. He tells us, too, of a learned clerk, who showed to a friend forests filled with wild deer, where he saw 100 of them slain, some with hounds and some with arrows. The hunting being finished, a company of falconers appeared upon the banks of a fair river, where the birds pursued the herons and slew them. He then saw knights jousting upon a plain, and, which was a more attractive sight, the resemblance of his beloved lady dancing, which occasioned him to dance also. But when the maester that this magique wrought thought fit, he clapped his hands together, and all was gone in an instant. Another feat, which he describes as having himself witnessed, is still more striking. There saw I Call Tregore, upon a table of sycamore, play an uncouth thing to tell. I saw him carry a windy mell under a walnut shell. It is probable that the deceptive effect was produced by the magic lantern and the concave mirror. With respect to the method to make the appearance of a flood of water to come into a house, the following recipe has been gravely handed down to us from our ancestors. Steep a thread in the liquor produced from snakes' eggs bruised, and hang it up over a basin of water in the place where the trick is to be performed. Recipes of this kind were perhaps meant to mislead those who wish to penetrate the mystery. In the reign of Charles II, jugglers appeared to have been in much repute with the great. In the diary of Evelyn, under the date of October 8, 1672, we find the following notice. I took my leave of my Lady Sunderland. She made me stay dinner at Leicester House, and afterwards sent for Richardson, the famous fire-eater. He melted a beer glass, and ate it quite up. Then, taking a live coal on his tongue, he put it on a raw oyster. The coal was blown on with bellows, till it flamed and sparkled in his mouth, and so remained till the oyster gasped and was quite boiled. Then he melted pitch and wax with sulphur, which he drank down as it flamed. I saw it flaming in his mouth a good while. He also took up a thick piece of iron, like an ironing heater, and when fiery hot held it between his teeth, then in his hand, and threw it about like a stone. But this, I believe, he cared not to hold very long. Lady Sunderland seemed fond of such exhibitions, as Mr. Evelyn recounts on another occasion that, dining with Lady Sunderland, I saw a fellow swallow a knife, and divers great pebble stones, which could make a plain rattling one against another. The knife was in sheath of horn. Caterfelto, described by Cowper as with his hair on end at his own wonders, wondering for his bread, was a compound of conjurer and quack doctor, and seems at one time to have enjoyed a great repute in his way. He practised on the people of London during the influenza of the year 1782, and added to his nostrums the fascination of hocus pocus. Among other philosophical apparatus, he employed the services of some extraordinary black cats, with which he astonished the ignorant and confounded the vulgar. He was not so successful out of London, as he was committed by the mayor of Shrewsbury to the common house of correction as a vagrant and impostor. But though European jugglers have manifested great skill in the various branches of their art, they appear to be far exceeded by those of other parts of the world. Clavigero describes many of the performances of Mexican professors, and adds that the first Spaniards who were witness of these and other exhibitions of the Mexicans were so much astonished at their agility that they suspected some supernatural power assisted them. It is, however, in the Asiatic and African quarters of the globe that the art of deluding the eye by false presentiments is to be found in its perfection. Sir John Mandeville gives an account of an exhibition which took place before the Great Khan. "And it be done by craft, or by necromancy," says he, "I wot not." That, in an unenlightened age, he should doubt whether necromancy had not something to do with such wonders is not astonishing. "They make," he tells us, "the appearance of the sun and the moon in the air, and then they make the night so dark that nothing can be seen, and again they restore the daylight, and the sun shining brightly. They then bring in dances of the fairest damsels of the world, and the richest arrayed. Afterwards they make other damsels to come in, bringing cups of gold, full of milk of divers animals, and give drink to the lords and ladies. And then they make knights joust in arms full lustily, who run together and in the encounter break their spears so rudely that the splinters fly all about the hall. They also bring in a hunting of the hart and of the boar, with hounds running at them open-mouthed, and many other things they do by the craft of their enchantments that are marvellous to see." Mandeville has a reputation, not justly in every instance, of being such a measureless liar that his evidence in this case may, perhaps, excite incredulity, but we must hesitate to disbelieve the old traveller when we find that similar, or even greater powers, are attested by an unexceptionable witness, no less a person than Jehangir, the Emperor of Hindustan. In his autobiography, that monarch enumerates no less than 28 tricks, which were played by Bengali jugglers before him and his court, and at which he expresses, as well he might, the utmost astonishment. One of them, that of cutting a man in pieces, and then producing him alive and perfect, resembles a trick which Ibn Battuta saw long before in China. Another was the putting of seeds of curious trees into the earth, which speedily grew to the height of 2 or 3 feet, and bore fruit. This was repeated at Madras, not many years ago, on the lawn before the Government House. A mango stone was put into the ground, which, to all appearance, rapidly sprung up into a fruit-bearing tree. Another of the tricks exhibited before the Emperor is equally marvellous. They produced a chain 50 cubits in length, and in my presence threw one end of it toward the sky, where it remained, as if fastened to something in the air. A dog was then brought forward, and being placed at the lower end of the chain, immediately ran up, and, reaching the other end, immediately disappeared in the air. In the same manner, a hog, a panther, a lion, and a tiger were alternately sent up the chain, and all equally disappeared at the upper end of the chain. At last they took down the chain and put it into a bag, no one ever discerning in what way the different animals were made to vanish into the air in the mysterious manner above described. This, I may venture to affirm, was beyond measure strange and surprising. Ibn Battuta, the celebrated traveller, who has been called the Mohammedan Marco Polo of the 14th century, to whom a reference has already been made, narrates delusions of the same kind, of which he was an eyewitness. He informs us that, when he was once in the presence of the Emperor of Hindustan, 2 yogis came in, whom the monarch desired to show him what he had never yet seen. They said, "We will." One of them then assumed the form of a cube, and arose from the earth, and, in this cubic shape, he occupied a place in the air over our heads. I was so much astonished and terrified at this, that I fainted and fell to the earth. The Emperor then ordered me some medicine which he had with him, and upon taking this I recovered and sat up, this cubic figure still remaining in the air just as he had been. His companion then took a sandal belonging to one of those who had come out with him, and struck it upon the ground as if he had been angry. The sandal then ascended until it became opposite in situation with the cube. It then struck it upon the neck, and the cube gradually descended to the earth, and at last rested in the place it had left. The Emperor then told me that the man who took the form of a cube was a disciple to the owner of the sandal. "And," continued he, "had I not entertained fears for the safety of thy intellect, I should have ordered him to show thee greater things than these." From this, however, I took a palpitation of the heart, until the Emperor ordered me a medicine, which restored me. It is not more than 7 years since a Brahmin died at Madras, who was accustomed to perform, apparently the difficult feat of sitting on the air. He did not exhibit for money, but merely as an act of courtesy. 40 minutes is said to have been the longest time that he ever remained in this extraordinary situation. The usual time seems to have been about 12 minutes. An eyewitness thus describes the act and the preparation for it. "The only apparatus seen is a piece of plank, which, with 4 pegs, he forms into a kind of long stool. Upon this, in a little brass saucer or socket, he places, in a perpendicular position, a hollow bamboo, over which he puts a kind of crutch, like that of a walking crutch, covering that with a piece of common hide. These materials he carries with him in a little bag, which is shown to those who come to see him exhibit. The servants of the house hold a blanket before him, and, when it is withdrawn, he is discovered poised in the air about 4 feet from the ground, in a sitting attitude, the outer edge of one hand merely touching the crutch, the fingers of that hand deliberately counting beads, the other hand and arm held up in an erect posture. The blanket was then held up before him, and they heard a gurgling noise, like that occasioned by wind escaping from a bladder or tube, and when the screen was withdrawn, he was again standing on terra firma. The same man has the power of staying under water for several hours. He declines to explain how he does it, merely saying he has been long accustomed to do so. The Brahmin died without communicating his secret, and though attempts were made to explain it, none of them were satisfactory. It was asserted by a native that it is treated of in the Shastras, and depends upon the art of fully suppressing the breath, and of cleansing the tubular organs of the body, joined to a peculiar mode of drawing, retaining, and ejecting the breath, an explanation which leaves the mystery as dark as ever. Egypt, which, more than 30 centuries ago, produced men so confident of their magical skills as to venture to emulate the miracles of Moses, still has pretenders to preternatural powers. The modern magicians seem by no means to be a degenerate race. One of their modes of delusion is the magic mirror of ink, and the address with which they manage the trick is really wonderful, and indeed inexplicable. It is performed by pouring ink into the hand of a boy not arrived at puberty, an unmarried woman, or a woman who is, as ladies wish to be who love their lords. The boy is told to look into the ink, and to say what he sees. Mr. Lane, in his recent valuable work on Egypt, has described the operation, and he declares his utter inability to account for the result. "After some preliminary ceremonies that had been gone through, the magician," says he, "addressed himself to me, and asked me if I wished the boy to see any person who was absent or dead. I named Lord Nelson, of whom the boy had evidently never heard, for it was with much difficulty he pronounced the name after several trials. The magician desired the boy to say to the Sultan, 'My master salutes thee, and desires thee to bring Lord Nelson. Bring him before my eyes, that I may see him speedily.' The boy then said so, and almost immediately added, 'A messenger is gone, and has returned, and has brought a man dressed in a black suit of European clothes.'" Footnote: Dark blue is called, by the modern Egyptians, uswed, which properly signifies black, and is therefore so translated here. End footnote. The man has lost his left arm. He then paused for a moment or two, and, looking more intently and more closely into the ink, he said, "No, he has not lost his left arm, but it is placed to his breast." This correction made his description more striking than it had been without it, since Lord Nelson generally had an empty sleeve attached to his coat, but it was the right arm that he had lost. Without saying that I suspected the boy had made a mistake, I asked the magician whether the objects appeared in the ink as if actually before the eyes, or as if in a glass, which makes the right appear left. He answered that they appeared as in a mirror. This rendered the boy's description faultless. Mr. Lane adds, "A short time since, after performing in the usual manner, by means of a boy, he prepared the magic mirror in the hand of a young English lady who, on looking into it for a little while, said that she saw a broom sweeping the ground without anybody holding it, and was so much frightened that she would look no more." To make this appearance understood, it must be mentioned that the first thing seen in the mirror is the sweeping of the ground by a broom. In the case of Lord Nelson, however, the broom was in the hands of a man. The boy is said not to have been a confederate of the magician. The same experiment was tried, at another time, in the presence of Captain Scott, but in this instance the conjurer seems to have been less proficient in his trade than the one who was employed by Mr. Lane, and the result was unsatisfactory to the captain. End of Chapter 15. Recording by Todd.
Chapter 16 of Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in July 2022. Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport. Chapter 16. Prodigies. A hold taken on the public mind by prodigies. Dutch boy with Hebrew words on the iris of each eye. Boy with the word Napoleon in the eye. Child with a golden tooth. Speculations on the subject. Superstition respecting changeling children in the Isle of Man. Waldron's deception of a changeling. Cases of extraordinary sleepers. The 7 sleepers of Ephesus. Men supposed, in the northern regions, to be frozen during the winter, and afterwards thought to life again. Dr. Oliver's case of a sleeper near Bath. Dr. Chain's account of Colonel Townsend's power of voluntarily suspending animation. Man buried alive for a month at Jaisalmer. The manner of his burial and his preparation for it. Prodigies of every kind, moral or physical, have ever taken hold of the imagination of the public, nor has the better education of some prevented them from lending a greedy ear to accounts of such phenomena, and the belief of the vulgar has thus been sanctioned and strengthened. Many, from interested speculation, have pretended to undergo most extraordinary privations, or to be independent of the established laws of nature. Such impostures met with a very flattering reception in the earlier part of the 18th century. Mr. Evelyn mentions a Dutch boy, 8 or 9 years old, who was carried about by his parents as a show. He had about the iris of one eye the words Deus meus, and about the other Elohim, in the Hebrew characters. How this was done by artifice none could imagine, and his parents affirmed he was born so. 3 years before this period, in 1699, Mr. C. Ellis wrote to Dr. Edwin Tyson that he had seen the Friesland boy, round the pupils of whose eyes, they pretend, are naturally engraved the above words. This is looked upon as a prodigious miracle in these parts, but, upon more nicely surveying it, I could perceive it was only the iris not circularly joined, but lashed into fimbriae, which might be thought to form imaginary letters. There is something like D, J, and V, but not a footstep for the strongest fancy to work out any more. But it was like to have been of danger to me to have discovered this trick, for acquainting a gentleman in English of this cheat, one of the mob happened to understand it, and I was forced to make the best of my way. It is hardly 3 years since a lad was exhibited in London who is said to have had Napoleon in distinct letters written in his eye. There is little doubt if this was really the case, but it was the result of artificial rather than natural causes. The eyes are not the only part of the head in which miraculous appearances have been supposed to be manifested. In 1593 it was reported that a child of 7 years old, in Silesia, having shed its teeth, a double tooth had been replaced by one of gold. This phenomenon soon brought a number of learned men into the field, to dissertate upon the wonder. Horst, more generally known under his Latinized name of Horstius, who was a professor of medicine, and really a man of abilities, wrote in raptures upon the subject. According to his idea, the production of the tooth was partly a natural and partly a miraculous event, and was intended by heaven to console the Christians for the perils to which they were exposed from the Turks. How consolation was to be derived from such a source, it would not be easy to discover. Horst was followed by Martin Ruland, another physician, who published a treatise called Nova et omni memoria, omnino inaudita historia de aureo dente, etc. 2 years after Ruland had given his tract to the world, the opinions which it broached were controverted by Ingesteterus, and were immediately defended, in another dissertation, by Ruland. Lastly, the pen was taken up by Libavius, an eminent chemist and physician, the first proposer of the transfusion of blood. Unhappily, all this labour and erudition were thrown away. Someone had, at last, the good sense to institute an inquiry as to the reality of the miracle, and, to the great discomfort of the literary and non-literary believers, it was discovered that the tooth was gilt. Waldron, in his Deception of the Isle of Man, says, "The old story of infants being changed in their cradles is here in such credit that mothers are in continual terror at the thoughts of it. I was prevailed on," says he, "to go and see a child, who, as they told me, was one of these changelings, and indeed I must own I was not a little surprised and shocked at the sight. Nothing under heaven could have a more beautiful face. Though between 5 and 6 years old and seemingly healthy, he was so far from being able to walk that he could not so much as move a joint. His limbs were vastly long for his age, but smaller than an infant's of 6 months, his complexion perfectly delicate, and he had the finest hair in the world. He never spoke or cried, ate scarce anything, and was very seldom seen to smile. But if any one called him fairy elf, he would frown, and fix his eyes so earnestly on those who had said it, as if he would look them through. His mother, or supposed mother, being poor, frequently went out a-cheering, and left home a whole day together. The neighbours, out of curiosity, have often looked in at the window to see how he behaved alone, which, whenever they did, they were sure to find him laughing and in the utmost delight. This made them judge that he was not without company, more pleasing to him than any mortal, and what made this seem more reasonable was, that if he was left ever so dirty, the woman, at her return, saw him with a clean face, and hair combed with the utmost exactness. Instances have been often recorded of extraordinary sleepers, which, supposing them to have been true, have puzzled physiologists to account for. So many eccentricities in the animal economy have been proved by a careful investigation to be impostures, that it is but natural to suppose them all to have been feigned, to accomplish some particular purpose. The popular tale of the 7 sleepers has had a most extending circulation, and, as a divine revelation, was extensively believed among the Mohammedans. When the Emperor Decius persecuted the Christians, 7 noble youths of Ephesus concealed themselves in a spacious cavern, the entrance to which the tyrant ordered should be firmly secured with a pile of stones. They immediately fell into a deep slumber, which was miraculously prolonged, without injuring the powers of life, during a period of 187 years. After this slumber, as they thought, of a few hours, they were pressed by the calls of hunger, and it was resolved that Jamblichus, one of them, should secretly return to the city for bread. The youth could hardly recognize his native city, and, to his surprise, a large cross was triumphantly erected over the principal gate of Ephesus. His singular dress and obsolete language confounded the baker, to whom he offered an ancient medal of Decius as the current coin of the empire. Taken up on suspicion, he found that 2 centuries had nearly elapsed since his escape from the tyrant. The bishop of Ephesus, the clergy, and others hastened to visit the cave of the 7 sleepers, who bestowed their benediction and peaceably expired. Arguing from analogy, it was supposed that the inhabitants of the colder regions hibernated, as certain smaller animals are known to do. Baron Herberstein, in his Commentaries on Russian History, asserts that there are in the northern parts of Muscovy, near the river Obi, on the borders of Tartary, a people he called Lukomori, who sleep from the 27th day of November till the 23rd day of April, like tortoises underground, and then come to life again, though quite frozen all the winter. This gentleman was a creditable sort of person, and twice ambassador in Russia, from Ferdinand the Emperor. It is most likely, however, that in points of this nature he was contented to rely on the reports of others. Dr. Oliver has given to the world a relation of an extraordinary sleeping person at Finsbury near Bath, the truth of which he seemed not to doubt. Samuel Chilton, in May 1694, fell into a profound sleep, out of which no art could rouse him, till after a month's time. During this time food and drink were put before him, which always disappeared, though no one ever saw him eat or drink. 2 years afterwards he slept 17 weeks, and in the following year for 5 months, with only one intermission for a few minutes. It does not appear from the relation that there was reason to suspect any imposture, yet it was rather remarkable that the stimulus of hunger should have induced him, though asleep, to eat and drink whatever was put before him, and yet the most powerful stimuli applied in other forms should have made no impression upon him. This protracted sleep, strange as it is, does not, however, appear so wonderful as the power of voluntarily suspending animation and returning to life after a considerable time has elapsed. A remarkable case of this kind is recorded by the celebrated Dr. Cheyne in his English Malady. The patient was a Colonel Townsend, a man of great honor and integrity, who had long been suffering under an acute nephritic disorder, attended with constant vomitings, which made life a burden to him. Early one morning he sent for his 2 physicians, Dr. Cheyne and Dr. Baynard. They went, accompanied by Mr. Skrine, his apothecary, and found his senses clear and his mind perfectly collected. He had, he said, sent for them that they might give him some account of an odd sensation which he had for some time observed and felt in himself, which was, that, composing himself, he could die or expire when he pleased, and yet, by an effort, or somehow, he could come to life again, which, says Jane, it seems he had sometimes tried before he had sent for us. The physicians were naturally surprised at this communication, and reluctant to believe a fact which was seemingly so improbable. Yet they hesitated to allow of his making the experiment before them, lest, in his debilitated state, he might carry it too far. He, however, insisted so strongly on their seeing the trial made, that they at last consented. We all 3, says Cheyne, felt his pulse first. It was distinct, though small and thready, and his heart had its usual beating. He composed himself on his back, and lay in a still position some time. While I held his right hand, Dr. Baynard laid his hand on his heart, and Mr. Skrine held a clean looking-glass to his mouth. I found his pulse sink gradually, till at last I could not feel any by the most exact and nice touch. Dr. Baynard could not find the least motion in his heart, nor Mr. Skrine the least soil of breath on the bright mirror which he held to his mouth. Then each of us by turns examined his arm, heart, and breath, but could not, by the nicest scrutiny, discover the least symptom of life in him. We reasoned a long time about this odd appearance as well as we could, and all of us judging it inexplicable and unaccountable, we began to conclude that he had indeed carried the experiment too far, and at last were satisfied he was actually dead, and were just ready to leave him. This continued about half an hour, by 9 o'clock in the morning, in autumn. As we were going away, we observed some motion about the body, and, upon examination, found his pulse and the motion of his heart gradually returning. He began to breathe gently and speak softly. We were all astonished to the last degree of astonishment at this unexpected change, and after some farther conversation with him, and among ourselves, went away fully satisfied as to all the particulars of this fact, but confounded and puzzled, and not able to form any rational scheme that might account for it. He afterwards called for his attorney, added a codicil to his will, settled legacies on his servants, received the sacrament, and calmly and composedly expired about 6 o'clock that evening. A case of voluntary death and resuscitation, still more remarkable, because the individual by whom the act was performed was buried alive, and remained for a month in his tomb, had recently occurred in India. The fact appears to be authenticated by unexceptionable evidence. The account is given in a letter by Lieutenant A.H. Boileau, an officer of engineers, who is employed on the extensive trigonometrical survey of India. "I have," says he, "just witnessed a singular circumstance of which I had heard during our stay at this place, but said nothing about it before, the time for its accomplishment not being completed. This morning, however, the full month was over, and a man who had been buried all the time, on the bank of a tank near our camp, was dug out alive, in the presence of Esualal, one of the ministers of the Muha Wool of XVIII, on whose account this singular individual was voluntarily interred a month ago. The man is said, by long practice, to have acquired the art of holding his breath by shutting the mouth, and stopping the interior opening of the nostrils with his tongue. He also abstains from solid food for some days previous to his interment, so that he may not be inconvenienced by the contents of his stomach while put up in his narrow grave. And, moreover, he is sewn up in a bag of cloth, and the cell is lined with masonry and floored with cloth, that the white ants and other insects may not easily be able to molest him. The place in which he was buried at XVIII is a small building about 12 feet by 8, built of stone, and in the floor was a hole about 3 feet long, 2½ feet wide, and the same depth, or perhaps a yard deep, in which he was placed in a sitting posture, sewed up in his shroud, with his feet turned inwards towards the stomach, and his hands also pointed inwards towards the chest. 2 heavy slabs of stone, 5 or 6 feet long, several inches thick, and broad enough to cover the mouth of the grave so that he could not escape, were then placed over him, and I believe a little earth was plastered over the whole, so as to make the surface of the grave smooth and compact. The door of the house was also built up, and people placed outside, that no tricks might be played nor deception practised. At the expiration of a full month, that is to say, this morning, the walling of the door was broken, and the buried man dug out of the grave, Trevelyan's moonshee only running there in time to see the ripping open of the bag in which the man had been enclosed. He was taken out in a perfectly senseless state, his eyes closed, his hands cramped and powerless, his stomach shrunk very much, and his teeth jammed so fast together that they were forced to open his mouth with an iron instrument to pour a little water down his throat. He gradually recovered his senses and the use of his limbs, and when we went to see him was sitting up, supported by 2 men, and conversed with us in a low, gentle tone of voice, saying that we might bury him again for a 12-month if we pleased. That his powers of abstinence are great, there can be no doubt, as Cornet MacNachtan once suspended him for 13 days, shut up in a wooden box. During the time that he is buried, his hair ceases to grow. Previously to his being buried, he lives entirely upon milk, regulating the quantity in such a manner as to be just sufficient for sustaining life. After his release, and on his first taking food, he is said to feel some anxiety, till he has ascertained that the faculties of his stomach and bowels are not injured. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of Sketches of Imposture, Deception and Credulity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Martin Hill. Sketches of Imposture, Deception and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport. Chapter 17. The Delusions of Alchemy. Origin of Alchemy. Argument for transmutation. Golden Age of Alchemy. Alchemists in the 13th century. Medals metaphorically described. Jargon of Dr. D. The Green Lion. Roger Bacon. Invention of gunpowder. Imprisonment of alchemists. Edict of Henry VI. Pope John the 22nd. Pope Sixtus V. Alchemy applied to medicine. Paracelsus. Evelyn's hesitation about alchemy. Narrative of Helvetius. Philadet on alchemy. Rosicrucians. A vision. Haydn's description of Rosicrucians. Dr. Price. Mr. Wolfe. Mr. Kellerman. The subject of alchemy occupies so large a space in the humiliating history of the misapplication of talent as to justify a particular inquiry into the causes of its origin, the grounds of its success, and the reason of its gradual decline. So much mysticism and fondness for ambiguity exist in the writings of the Hermetic philosophers, as they were called, that it will not be surprising to find accounts of the origin of the science wrapped in equally extraordinary language. To begin with Adam, he is said to have foreseen the deluge, and for the purpose of providing against that catastrophe, to have erected 2 tables of stone, which contained the foundation of this wisdom. One of them, after the flood, was found on Mount Ararat. Alchemy has as frequently been called the Hermetic art, as it is more generally supposed to have been invented by Hermes, king of Egypt, and master of this science, when Egypt was the garden of God. According to chronologers, his era was before that of Moses. This was the true philosopher's stone, which so enriched that kingdom, and by means of which all the arts flourished, but in quest of which so many persons of all nations and ages have since fruitlessly consumed both their fortunes and lives. Unlike their baffled successors, the Egyptians increased their wealth to that immense degree that they studied means how to expend their exuberant stores in the erection of pyramids, obelisks, colossuses, monuments, pensile gardens, cities, and the labyrinth, and in forming the immense Lake Moeris, and the like stupendous works, which cost so many millions of talents. All these, say the believers in science, are sufficient arguments of their skill in alchemy, whence they received so vast a supply of riches. For since no authors mention any gold mines in the time of Osiris or Hermes, whence could they have acquired such exceeding great wealth, but from the chemical art of transmuting metals? The Egyptian priests, under a promise of secrecy, communicated the knowledge they possessed to the Alexandrian Greeks. The actual possession of much lucrative knowledge, and the reputation of still more valuable secrets, would attract the notice of the credulous and ignorant. With many, the extent of the science was confined to the refining of metals and preparations of chemical compounds. But the theoretical alchemist, having in view a certain mysterious and unattainable object, despised the occupation of the mere chemist, and from policy or want of clear ideas on the subject, the language of his art became more and more obscure. Knaves and impostors crept in, and, by impositions on the unwary and credulous, indemnified themselves for the ill success of their experiments. Those chemists who assumed the pompous title of alchemists were persuaded that all metals were no other than nature's rude, unfinished essays towards the making of gold, which, by means of due coction in the bowels of the earth, advanced gradually towards maturity, till at last they were perfected into that beautiful metal. Their endeavours, therefore, were to finish what nature had begun, by procuring for the imperfect metals this much-desired coction, and upon this grand principle all their processes were dependent. The golden age of alchemy commenced, properly speaking, with the conquests of Arabian fanaticism in Asia and Africa, about the time of the destruction of the Alexandrian library, and the subjection of Europe to the basest superstition. The Saracens, lively, subtle, and credulous, intimate with the fables of talismans and celestial influences, admitted, with eager faith, the wonders of alchemy. The rage of making gold spread through the whole Mahometan world, and in the splendid courts of Al-Mansur and Harun al-Rashid, the professors of the Hermetic art found patronage, disciples, and emolument. About the 13th century, Albertus Magnus, Roger Bacon, and Raymond Lully appeared as the revivers of this science, which had nearly been lost in the interval from the 10th century. Their writings again raised alchemy to a very high degree of credit, and their adventures, as well as those of their disciples, partake more of the character of Oriental romance than the results of philosophic study. The most celebrated of the alchemic philosophers were not only the companions of princes, but many of them were even kings themselves, who chose this royal road to wealth and magnificence. No delusion in the world ever excited so extensive and long-continued an interest, or rather it might be called madness, though it now seems wonderful how the fallacy of it should have escaped detection during a period of 700 or 800 years, when so many causes for suspicion and disappointment must have occurred amongst its professors. But the fond idea seems to have been strengthened by this want of success, which was attributed to any cause rather than the proper one. An alchemist, in his writings, complains of the difficulties attending the search after the immortal dissolvent, as the grand agent in the operations was sometimes called, and very feelingly asserts that the principal one is the want of subsistence or money, as without a supply of the latter to buy glasses, build furnaces, etc., the operations cannot go on. The several metals were described metaphorically as plants, animals, etc., and mystical allusions were made to the sacred scriptures, in confirmation of the truth of the science, by the most forced interpretations of certain passages, as for instance, he struck the stone and water poured out, and he poured oil out of the flinty rock. And the whole composition of the philosopher's stone was thought to be contained in the 4 verses beginning, he stretched forth the heavens as a curtain, the waters stood above the mountains. The descriptions of the several necessary processes partook of such figurative language as none but the adepts could possibly understand. Dr. D, in the fullness of his wisdom, thus instructs his disciples. The contemplative order of the Rosy Cross have presented to the world angels, spirits, plants, and metals, with the times in astromancy and geomancy, to prepare and unite them telesmatically. This is the substance which at present in our study is the child of the sun and moon, placed between two fires, and in the darkest night receives a light from the stars and retains it. The angels and intelligences are attracted by a horrible emptiness, and attend the astrolazums forever. He hath in him a thick fire, by which he captivates the thin genii. That you may know the Rosicrucian philosophy, endeavour to know God himself, the worker of all things. Now I will demonstrate in what thing, of what thing, and by what thing, is the medicine or multiplier of metals to be made. It is even in the nature, of the nature, and by the nature of metals. For it is a principle of all philosophy that nature cannot be bettered but in her own nature. Common gold and silver are dead, and except they be renewed by art, that is, except their seeds, which are naturally included in them, be projected into their natural earth, by which means they are mortified and revived, like as the grain of wheat that is dead. This is somewhat worse than what Mr. Burke denominated a gypsy jargon. The powder of transmutation, the grand means of projection, was to be got at by the following process, in which it was typified as the green lion. In the green lion's bed the sun and moon are born, they are married and beget a king. The king feeds on the lion's blood, which is the king's father and mother, who are, at the same time, his brother and sister. I fear I betrayed the secret, which I promised my master to conceal in dark speech from every one who does not know how to rule the philosopher's fire. One would imagine, in the present day, that there was very little fear of being accused of too rashly divulging the important secret by such explanations. Our ancestors must have had a much greater talent than we have for finding out enigmas, if they were able to elicit a meaning from these mystical, or rather nonsensical, sentences. Roger Bacon was the first English alchemist. He was born in 1214. Popular belief attributed to him the contrivance of a machine to rise in the air, and convey a chariot more speedily than by horses, and also the art of putting statues in motion, and drawing articulate sounds from brazen heads. From this it appears that he had made considerable progress in the formation of automata. There can be no doubt that he discovered the mode of making gunpowder. In his works the secret may be found, veiled under an anagram. The discovery has, however, on doubtful authority, been ascribed to Berthold Schwarz, a German Benedictine friar, who lived about the middle of the 14th century. In an old print, the merit of the invention is ascribed to the devil, who is represented as prompting the friar's operations and enjoying their success. Can we be surprised that in an age of ignorance the wonderful doings of Bacon obtained for him the name of magician, and the friars of his own order refused to admit his works into their library, as though he was a man who ought to be proscribed by society? His persecution increased until 1278, when he was imprisoned, and obliged to own that he repented of the pains he had taken in the arts and sciences, and he was at last constrained to abandon the house of his order. The credulity and avarice of princes often caused them to arrest alchemists, and, by means of the torture, endeavour to force them to multiply gold, or furnish the powder of projection, that it might be ready for use at any time. But it was generally found that, like poetical composition, perfect freedom of thought and action when necessary to so desirable an end. There is an edict of Henry VI, King of England, in letters patent to lords, nobles, doctors, professors and priests, to engage them in the pursuit of the philosopher's stone, especially the priests, who having power, as says the pious king, to convert bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, may well convert an impure into a perfect metal. Even Pope John XXII, the father of the Church, was weak enough to become an adept. He worked at the practice of Hermetic philosophy in Avignon, and at his death were found 18 millions of florins in gold, and 7 millions in jewels and sacred vases. Notwithstanding his writing a treatise on alchemy and making transmutations, yet such was the mischief arising in his times from the knavery of pretended alchemists, that he issued a bull condemning all traders in this science as impostors. Pope Sixtus V had a true idea of the real value of this science, for when one presented to him a book on alchemy, His Holiness gave the author an empty purse, emblematic of the vanity of the study. In the 15th century, this science was applied to medical uses, and the preparations of mercury, antimony, and other metals were used with the happiest success. The unexpected success which attended the first exhibition of chemical preparations awakened a new hope in the minds of the alchemists, which was no less than the discovery of a universal medicine, an elixir vitae, for conferring immortality and perpetual youth and health. Paracelsus and Van Helmont entertained these visionary speculations, and hopes of possessing a universal solvent long haunted the imaginations of writers on chemistry. Paracelsus was born in 1494. He practiced physic in Basel, and the following circumstance induced him to leave it. A canon was in extreme sickness, and the physicians forsook him as incurable. Paracelsus saw him, and promised to restore him to health. The canon expressed himself gratefully, as one would feel the obligation, and make him a suitable recompense. 2 pills performed the cure, which was no sooner effected than the canon undervalued it, and contended, against the claim of the doctor, he had been cured too soon. The magistrates replied to, and they awarded Paracelsus a very moderate fee, proportioned to his short attendance. So, in disgust, he quitted the city, and declared that he would leave the inhabitants of Basel to the eternal destruction which they deserved. He then retired to Strasbourg, and thence into Hungary, where he took to drinking. He died in great poverty at Salzburg in 1541. Operinus, who served him as his pupil, said he often saw him in great want, borrowing money of carmen and porters, and the next day he would repay them double from a fund that could not be discovered. His proper name was Philip Aureolus Theophrastus Paracelsus Bombastus of Hohenheim, and his disciples add: Prince of Physicians, Philosopher of Fire, the Trismegistus of Switzerland, Reformer of Alchemistical Philosophy, Nature's faithful secretary, Master of the Elixir of Life, and Philosopher's Stone, great monarch of chemical secrets. The ingenious Mr. Evelyn, both a sensible and learned man, seems to have been unwilling to deny the truth of what had so often been asserted to him. In his entertaining diary, he says, June 4th, 1705, the season very dry and hot. I went to see Dr. Dickinson, the famous chemist. We had a long conversation about the philosopher's elixir, which he believed attainable, and himself had seen it performed by one who went under the name of Mundanus, who sometimes came among the adepts, but was unknown as to his country or abode. The doctor has written a treatise in Latin, full of astonishing revelations. He is a very learned man, formerly of St. John's, Oxford, where he practised physic. Being in Paris, Mr. Evelyn visited Marc Antonio, an ingenious enameller, who told him 2 or 3 stories of men who had the great arcanum, and who had successfully made projection before him several times. This, says Evelyn, who obviously hesitated between doubt and belief, Antonio asserted with great obtestation, "Nor know I what to think of it. There are so many impostors, and people who love to tell strange stories, as this artist did, who had been a great rover and spake 10 different languages." The most celebrated history of transmutation is that given by Helvetius in his Brief of the Golden Calf. It is thus given by Mr. Brand. The 27th day of December 1666 came a stranger to my house at the Hague, in a plebeic habit, of honest gravity and serious authority, of a mean stature, and a little long face, black hair not at all curled, a beardless chin, and about 44 years of age, and born in North Holland. After salutation he beseeched me, with great reverence, to pardon his rude access, for he was a lover of the pyrotechnian art, and having read my treatise against the sympathetic powder of Sir Kenelm Digby, and observed my doubt about the philosophic mystery, induced him to ask me if I really was a disbeliever as to the existence of an universal medicine, which would cure all diseases, unless the principal parts were perished, or the predestinated time of death come. I replied, I never met with an adept, or saw such a medicine, though I had fervently prayed for it. Then I said, Surely you are a learned physician. No, said he, I am a brass founder, and a lover of chemistry. He then took from his bosom pouch a neat ivory box, and out of it 3 ponderous lumps of stone, each about the bigness of a walnut. I greedily saw and handled this most noble substance, the value of which might be somewhere about 20 tons of gold. And having drawn from the owner many rare secrets of its admirable effects, I returned him this treasure of treasures, with a most sorrowful mind, humbly beseeching him to bestow a fragment of it upon me, in perpetual memory of him, though but the size of a coriander seed. No, no, said he, that is not lawful, though thou wouldst give me as many golden ducats as would fill this room, for it would have particular consequences, and if fire could be burned of fire, I would at this instant rather cast it into the fiercest flames. He then asked if I had a private chamber, whose prospect was from the public street, so I presently conducted him to my best furnished room, backwards, which he entered, said Helvetius in the true spirit of Dutch cleanliness, without wiping his shoes, which were full of snow and dirt. I now expected he would bestow some great secret upon me, but in vain. He asked for a piece of gold, and opening his doublet, showed me 5 pieces of that precious metal, which he wore upon a green riband, and which very much excelled mine in flexibility and colour, each being the size of a small trencher. I now earnestly again craved a crumb of the stone, and at last, out of his philosophical commiseration, he gave me a morsel as large as a rapeseed. But I said, This scanty portion will scarcely transmute 4 grains of lead. Then, said he, deliver it me back, which I did, in hopes of a greater parcel. But he, cutting off half with his nail, said, Even this is sufficient for thee. Sir, said I, with a dejected countenance, what means this? And he said, Even that will transmute 1/2 ounce of lead. So I gave him great thanks, and said, I would try it, and reveal it to no one. He then took his leave, and said he would call again next morning at 9. I then confessed that while the mass of his medicine was in my hand the day before, I had secretly scraped off a bit with my nail, which I projected in lead, but it caused no transmutation, for the whole flew away in fumes. Friend, said he, thou art more dexterous in committing theft than in applying medicine. Hadst thou wrapped up thy stolen prey in yellow wax, it would have penetrated and transmuted the lead into gold. I then asked if the philosophic work cost much, or required a long time, for philosophers say that 9 or 10 months are required for it. He answered, their writings are only to be understood by the adepts, without whom no student can prepare this magistery. Fling not away, therefore, thy money and goods in hunting out this art, for thou shalt never find it. To which I replied, as thy master showed it thee, so mayest thou, perchance, discover something thereof to me, who know the rudiments, and therefore it may be easier to add to a foundation than begin anew. In this art, said he, it is quite otherwise, for, unless thou knowest the thing from head to heel, thou canst not break open the glassy seal of Hermes. But enough. Tomorrow, at the 9th hour, I will show thee the manner of projection. But Elias never came again. So my wife, who was curious in the art whereof the worthy man had discovered, teased me to make the experiment with the little spark of bounty the artist had left. So I melted 1/2 ounce of lead, upon which my wife put in the said medicine. It hissed and bubbled, and in 1/4 of an hour the mass of lead was transmuted into fine gold, at which we were exceedingly amazed. I took it to the goldsmith, who judged it most excellent, and willingly offered 50 florins for each ounce. The accumulated disappointments of several centuries in the prosecution of this science or discovery did not eradicate the belief in its practicability, and, so late as the year 1698, one, humbly styling himself Philadept, wrote a book concerning adepts, not proving that they did exist, but leaving the onus probandi to those who were sceptical on the subject. Indeed, it was a generally received opinion in the 17th century that the philosopher's stone did really exist, and the gravity and sincerity of the authors who discoursed of it prove this. Philadept says, it is evidently unreasonable to assert or deny anything without reason. No man can give any good reason, importing that there is no such thing as the philosopher's stone. On the contrary, there are many reasons to believe there is such a thing. There is a tradition of it in the world. There are many books on that subject, written by men that show an extraordinary gravity, sincerity, and fear of God, and who solemnly and sacredly protest they have wrought it with their own hands. And besides, they have, at several times, shown the effects of it before diverse witnesses, whereof there are too many instances to reject this proof. Then they lay down principles which appear rational to anyone that considers them. There have been, also, too many great cures performed by philosophers to be reasonably questioned by them who are acquainted with those matters. Those that are not, ought not, in reason, to determine against it. My intention is not to dispute about the principles of Hermetic philosophy. They've been established by many authors beyond dispute, but most clearly and invincibly by the learned Gasto Clavius, of any I know. Passages in Scripture, as has been stated above, were often brought forward in corroboration of the theory of alchemy, and it resulted, in the course of time, that a religious sect arose, who blended the mysteries of the Christian religion with the several processes of alchemy, toward the grand regeneration of metals, a species of allegory understood and to be interpreted only by the disciples of that order, known by the name of Rosy Cross, its symbol being 4 red roses, arranged in a crucial form. In later times there have been a few believers in transmutation. In the year 1782, Dr. Price, of Guildford, by means of a white and red powder, professed to convert mercury into silver and gold, and he is said to have convinced many disbelievers of the possibility of such a change. His experiments were repeated 7 times before learned and intelligent persons, who themselves furnished all the materials except the powders, which were to operate the transmutation. These powders were in very small quantity. By whatever means it may have been accomplished, it is certain that gold and silver were produced, but admitting that, with respect to its production, Price was an impostor, it is indubitable that he must have been in possession of one valuable secret, that of fixing mercury, so as not to evaporate in a red heat. Price published an account of these experiments, but stated that he had expended the whole of his powder, and that he could not obtain more except by a tedious process, which had already injured his health, and which, therefore, he would not repeat. He died in the following year, and his death was attributed to his having swallowed laurel water, in order to evade further scrutiny and the detection of his imposture. The fact of his having poisoned himself is at least doubtful. Another true believer in the mysteries of this art, says Mr. Brand, was Peter Wolfe. He occupied chambers in Barnard's Inn, when he resided in London. His rooms, which were extensive, were so filled with furnaces and apparatus that it was difficult to reach his fireside. A gentleman once put down his hat, and never could find it again, such was the confusion of boxes, packages, and parcels that lay about the chamber. Wolfe had long vainly searched for the elixir, and attributed his repeated failures to the want of due preparation by pious and charitable acts. Some of his apparatus is said to have been extant since his death, upon which are supplications for success, and for the welfare of the adepts. He had an heroic remedy for illness. When he felt himself seriously indisposed, he took a place in the Edinburgh Mail, and, having reached that city, immediately came back in the returning coach to London. He died in 1805. The last of the English alchemists seems to have been a gentleman of the name of Kellerman, who, as lately as 1828, was living at Lilly, a village between Luton and Hitchin. He was a singular character, who shunned all society, carried 6 loaded pistols in his pockets, barricaded his house, and filled his ground with spring guns. The interior of his dilapidated mansion was a complete chaos. He pretended to have discovered the universal solvent, the art of fixing mercury, and the powder of projection. With the last of these he had, he said, made gold, and could make as much as he pleased. He kept 8 men for the purpose of superintending his crucibles, 2 at a time being employed, who were relieved every 6 hours. He had one characteristic of a disturbed intellect, that of believing that all the world was in a confederacy against him, and that there was a conspiracy to assassinate him. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Martin Hill. Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport. Chapter 18. Astrology. Supposed origin of astrology. Butler on the transmission of astrological knowledge. Remarks on astrology by Hervé. Petrarch's opinion of astrology. Catherine of Medici. Casting of nativities in England. Moore's Almanac. Writers for and against astrology. Horoscope of Prince Frederick of Denmark. Astrologers contributed sometimes to realize their own predictions. Caracalla. Astrology has been divided into natural and judiciary, or judicial, but it is only the latter division which will come under present consideration, and its definition has been said to be the art of foretelling future events, from the aspects, positions, and influences of the heavenly bodies. The idea that they should have any influence, direct or indirect, on our actions in this netherworld, or that they oblige us to the performance of any act, however extraordinary, may have been originally supposed by those who were familiar with the figurative language of the prophets, to receive confirmation from the facts, and the style of the predictions, recorded in sacred history. They would find, for instance, that the star in the east was foretold, which at its coming was to announce peace and goodwill towards men, and the later and more solemn revelations concerning the final consummation of all things typified that awful event by signal appearances in the heavens. Traditionary knowledge of these events and predictions, coupled with ignorance of the causes of meteorological phenomena, now better understood, might easily lead the timid and superstitious to forebode evil from the disastrous twilight of the eclipse, or to impute a favouring influence to the rising of certain stars at particular seasons. The universal custom of traversing the deserts, or navigating ships across the pathless ocean, by the observation of the stars, previously to the discovery of the compass, led the imaginative to conceive that the moral path of life was equally to be regulated by astral indications. It must be owned, too, that it was not unnatural for simple unreasoning minds thus to connect the glorious sun, the moon, when walking in brightness, queen of heaven, and the host of stars, with the destinies of man. Fear, it is said, first deified the ancient heroes. It was a storm and an eclipse that first consecrated Romulus. Nor had Jupiter himself been master of heaven, or worshipped on earth, if the terrors of his thunders had not advanced the conceit of his divinity. It is quite certain that, by degrees, a system was formed, which took hold of the imaginations of all classes of persons, and the truth of such a doctrine, and its decisions, it was heretical to doubt. J. Butler, one of the devout believers in astrology, far from thinking it a remnant of pagan superstition, calls it a divine science. He pretended, with many others, that Adam, after his fall, communicated it out of his memories of the state of innocency to Seth. He, in turn, made impressions of the same in certain permanent pillars, able to withstand fire and water, by which means the science passed to Enoch and Noah. Shem was instructed by his father, and communicated his knowledge to Abram, who carried it to Chaldea and Egypt. Moses, skilled in all the learning of the Egyptians, was also thought to have been an able astrologer. Thus was the vanity of the more modern professors of the art encouraged, and they maintained that the heavens were one great volume, wherein God had written the history. And, of course, it was to be understood that the astrologers were the high priests, who alone could expound its mysterious pages. The author of the Contemplations on the Starry Heavens has, with great propriety, made the following remarks on this science. The pretenders to judicial astrology talk of I know not what mysterious efficacy in the different aspects of the stars, or the various conjunction and opposition of the planets. Let those who are unacquainted with the sure word of revelation give ear to these sons of delusion and dealers in deceit. For my own part, it is a question of indifference to me whether the constellations shone with smiles, or lowered in frowns, on the hour of my nativity. Can these bodies advertise me of future events, which are unconscious of their own existence? In the time of Petrarch, though astrologers had great credit, the learned man only laughed at their pretensions. Of one of them, in particular, he says, "The astrologer was older and wiser than I was. I loved him, and should have been still more attached to him if he had not been an astrologer. I sometimes joked, and sometimes reproached him about his profession. One day, when I'd been sharper than usual with him, he replied, with a sigh, 'Friend, you are in the right. I think as you do, but I have a wife and children.' This answer touched me so much that I never spoke to him again on that subject." Queen Catherine of Medici, though a woman of strong mind, was deluded with the more ignorant by the vanity of astrological judgments, The professors of the science were so much consulted in her court that the most inconsiderable act was not to be done without an appeal to the stars. In England, William Lilly, John Gadbury, and others set up for profits, and nativities were cast for all who could afford to pay for the privilege of searching into futurity. It was but natural that the inquirers should have to reward such intelligence in proportion to the distance it was brought, or its flattering nature. Events, however, soon proved it to be far-fetched and nothing worth. The volumes of tiresome absurdity written on this subject about the beginning and middle of the 17th century would exceed present belief, and nothing but a thorough, though unaccountable conviction in their readers that they spoke the language of truth could ever have made the perusal of them tolerable. Moore's prophetic almanac, with its astrological predictions and hieroglyphic for the year, is the only legacy left to us of this species of composition and imposition. It would be beneath the dignity of such a philosopher to be guilty of a pun, though the more irreverent of his readers might naturally have suspected him of such an intention, when, a few years since, he prophesied that towards the close of the year Turkey will be much embroiled. Some writers, in the more fortunate era of astrology, ventured to impugn the truth of the doctrine, and to ridicule its professors, particularly in the persons of Lilly and Gadbury, who retorted with acrimonious and arrogant vulgarity. Further curiosity on this subject may be gratified by turning to such works as Supernatural Sights and Apparitions, Seen in London by William Lilly, or the reply to it, Black Monday Turned White, or A Whip at Stargazers. One of the opposers of this science argued, naturally enough, that God had assigned the stars their sight and course, which no power of man or angel was able to alter. But man's fancy had built us imaginary houses in the heavens, to which were attached such qualifications, affections, etc., as the framers pleased. These houses were 12 in number, in one or other of which, according to the hour and season of the person's birth, did he take his position, as pointed out in the horoscope. An outline of a general horoscope is annexed, and, in explanation of it, Mr. William Lilly is pleased to say, "When I speak of the 10th house, I intend somewhat of kings or persons represented by that house, which is also called medium coeli, the mid-heaven. When mention is made of the first house, ascendant or horoscope, I intend the commonalty in general. Dic et eris mihi magnus Apollo." The signification of the 12 houses of heaven in an annual revolution, by which every one is directed to the key of the book. 1. Ascendant, commonalty, vulgar life of every man. 2. Wealth, riches, estate, movable goods. 3. Kindred, neighbours, small journeys. 4. Fathers, towns, castles, kings' wives. 5. Children, ambassadors, commissioners. 6. Servants, small cattle, sickness. 7. Women, wars, lawsuits, suitors. 8. Death, inheritance. 9. Clergymen, long journeys, religion. 10. Kings, emperors, princes, generals, commanders of armies. 11. Friends in general, servants in particular, their aid or service. 12. Whispering, great cattle, envy, sorcery. Mr. Gadbury, also, in the nativity cast for the illustrious Prince Frederick of Denmark, informs us that it is an aphorism nearly as old as astrology itself, that if the lord of the ascendant of a revolution be essentially well placed, it declares the native to be pleasant, healthful, and of a sound constitution of body, and rich in quiet of mind all that year, and that he shall be free from cares, perturbations, and troubles. The nativity of Prince Frederick of Denmark, astrologically performed by John Gadbury, 1660. It often happened, with regard to the responses given by the oracles, that they in some measure corresponded with the subsequent events. In like manner did the astrological casters of nativities seem to have their presumptuous pretensions verified by after circumstances. Caracalla lost his life by seeking to preserve it from supposed treachery. For, while in Mesopotamia, being jealous of a plot against him, he sent to the Roman astrologers for the particulars of it. They accused Macrinus, his faithful prefect, of a conspiracy, which nothing but his death could frustrate. This answer coming while the emperor was intent on some sport, he gave it to Macrinus to read, who, finding his innocent life in danger by this trick of the astrologers, secured it by the murder of Caracalla, of which, even in thought, he had before been innocent, though the result proved the apparent truth of the prediction of the astrologers. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by docdlmartin. Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport. Medical Delusions and Frauds, Part 1. State of Medicine in Remote Ages. Animals, Teachers of Medicine. Gymnastic Medicine. Cato's Cure for a Fracture. Dearness of Ancient Medicines and Medical Books. Absurdity of the Ancient Materia Medica. Gold, Bazaar, Mummy. Prescription for a Quartan. Amulets. Virtues of gems, corals, charms, charm for sore eyes, medicine connected with astrology, cure by sympathy, Sir Kenelm Digby, the real cause of the cure, the vulnerary powder, etc., the royal touch, Evelyn's description of the ceremony, Valentine, great rakes, Morley's cure for scrofula, inoculation, vaccination, Dr. Jenner, animal magnetism, M. Lowe's account of it, Mesmer and his feats, manner of magnetizing, report of a commission on the subject, metallic tractors, Baron Silferkilm and the souls in white robes, Mr. Luderborg, empirics, uroscopy, Meyersbach, Lefebvre, remedies for the stone, the anodyne necklace, the universal medicine. Conclusion. The history of the art of medicine begins with fable and conjecture, and rests on dubious tradition. 50 years prior to the Trojan War, Aesculapius is said to have been deified on account of his medical skill, and Machaon and Podalirius, his sons, formed the medical staff of the Grecian army before Troy. In the temples of the gods, diseases and cures were registered and engraved on marble tables and hung up for the benefit of others. The priests at that time prepared the medicines and made it a lucrative trade, and fables were invented to increase the renown of the oracle, for difficult cases were stated to be caused by the immediate wrath of heaven, in which the only remedies were prayer and sacrifices, fear urging the trembling patients to follow whatever course was prescribed. From the sacred writings, little medical information is derived. Moses gave precautionary directions for the prevention or cure of leprosy, consisting chiefly of cleanliness, and religion was called in to enforce the medicinal ordinances. In Babylon, we are told by Herodotus that the sick were carried out to the public roads, that travelers might converse with them and acquaint them with any remedies they had seen used in such complaints with success. In Egypt, each physician applied himself to one disease, and Prosper Alpinus, in his History of Egyptian Medicine, reports that they took the hints of curing divers diseases from brute beasts. Thus, phlebotomy was taken from a practice noticed in the hippopotamus or river horse, which bleeds itself when plethoric, by pressing its thigh on a sharp-pointed reed. Dogs and cats are known when sick to vomit themselves by eating grass. Swine, when ill, refuse meat, and so recover by abstinence. In like manner, from numerous bodies as flies, locusts, etc., being enclosed in amber, it is thought the art of embalming was first suggested. Gymnastic medicine was founded by Herodicus. Games and sports had been early instituted in the Grecian states and were divided into religious, military, athletic, and lastly, medical gymnastics, particularly adapted for the prevention or cure of diseases. Herodicus, from his own observations on its advantages, commenced practicing as a physician, and it was his only panacea. After him came Hippocrates, who made the first successful attempt to separate the medical profession from rash empiricism and the frivolous dreams of philosophers. He compared the body to a circle in which an universal sympathy of parts existed. His great repute arose from his skill in predicting crises, which he was enabled to do with perfect precision. Pliny says Rome was inhabited 600 years before any physicians established themselves there, and for some time the medicine of the Romans consisted of charms, fascinations, incantations, and amulets. The book of Cato de Re Rustica is a proof of the gross superstition and ignorance of those times. He proposed in a case of fracture to have it bound up, and the following words sung every day: Huet, hanat, istapista, fista, diminabo, damnastra, et luxata. When the religious frenzy of the Mohammedans was abated, and they became enriched by commerce, arts, and literature, after ages of barbarism, were again cultivated with great industry, and the medical profession in particular was rewarded and encouraged with rank and bountiful endowments. Aetius complained in his time of the general use of quack medicines, nostrums, etc., and of the immense price demanded for those which were fortunate enough to rise into general repute. Danaus, he tells us, sold his collyrium at Constantinople at the astonishing price of 120 pieces of gold to each patient, and sometimes could scarcely be persuaded upon to sell it at any price. Nicostratus demanded no less than 2 talents for his celebrated isothiosis, or antidote against the colic. The works of the Grecian and Arabian physicians, when they came to be more generally known in the 15th century, were most highly prized. In the year 1471, Louis XI borrowed the works of Rhazes from the Paris faculty, but was obliged previously to deposit a quantity of plate and find a nobleman to join with him as an additional security for the care and safe return of the book. Jew physicians were at that time employed by the Pope and most of the crowned heads in Europe. John of Gaddesden was the first Englishman appointed court physician in London. His idea of the treatment of diseases was rather different from the theories of the present day, for when attending the king's son for smallpox, he directed the room to be hung with scarlet cloth and the patient to be rolled up in similar stuff. The rationale of the materia medica 150 or 200 years since was very extraordinary, as well with respect to the nature of the substances proposed as remedies, as to the number of ingredients, sometimes 30 or 40, which were congregated together in each composition, upon the principle that if one did not reach the disorder, another might. The nature of the substances used was often even more extraordinary and disgusting than their variety. Many of them were thought to act by a charm, or by the strong sensation of disgust, which their exhibition excited, rather than by any more direct appeal to the disordered part. The more precious also the article, the more certain was thought the cure. The aurum potabile and other preparations of gold were conceived to have many virtues. Gold, by the chemical writers, was styled the son and king of metals. Kings and princes were thus amused and defrauded, and their lives made shorter than those of their subjects who were beneath the use of gold. The chickens they ate were fed with gold, that they might extract the sulfur and prepare the metal by their circulation. The physicians were contented to collect all the gold which passed unaltered and undiminished through the poultry into their pockets. Bizor notes an antidote from a Persian word and is generally applied to medical stones generated in the stomach and other viscera of animals. Bizors usually attain the size of acorns or pigeons' eggs. The larger, the more valuable. A stone of 1 ounce was sold in India for 100 livres, and one of 4 ounces and a quarter for 2,000. They were very scarce, and few of the genuine ever came into the European market, the greater number that were sold being artificial compounds. The hog bizor, or pedra del porco, was first brought into Europe by the Portuguese. It is found in the gallbladder of a boar in the East Indies. The Indians attribute infinite virtues to it, as a preservative against poison, cholera, etc. The porcupine and monkey bizors were held in such esteem by the natives of Malacca that they never parted with them unless as presents to ambassadors and princes. Single stones have been sold for 60 or 80 pounds sterling. In 1715, bizor was thought equal in value to gold. Dr. Patten says of it, the most visible operation it hath is when the bill is paid, and he calls it the scandalous stone of offense and lasting monument of perseverance in imposture. The most loathsome preparations were recommended and eagerly used by the sick. Mummy had the honor to be worn in the bosom, next the heart, by kings and princes, and all those who could bear the price. It was pretended that it was able to preserve the wearer from the most deadly infections, and that the heart was secured by it from the invasion of all malignity. A dram of a preparation called treacle of mummy, taken in the morning, prevented the danger of poison for all that day. Thus decayed spices and gums, with the dead body of an Egyptian, were thought to give long life. To cure a quartan or the gout, take the hair and nails, cut them small, mix them with wax, and stick them to a live crab, casting it into the river again. The moss from a dead man's skull was held to be of sovereign virtue in some cases. Amulets were much used formerly, not only to cure, but to prevent disease, and also were thought to have a wonderful power over the moral qualities and affections. The onyx, worn as an amulet, strengthened the heart and refreshed phantasms. The ruby resisted poisons and preserved from the plague. If a man was in danger, it changed color and became dim, but recovered its brightness when the danger was past. Hence, perhaps, was the original motive for carrying jewels and precious stones set in rings or in seals. Corals, says Paracelsus, are of 2 sorts. One, a clear, bright, shining red, the other a purple dark red. The bright is good to quicken fancy, and is against fantasies or nocturnal spirits, which fly from these bright corals as a dog from a staff, but they gather where the dark coral is. A spectre or ghost is the starry body of a dead man. Now these ethereal or starry bodies cannot endure to be where the bright corals are, but the dark-colored allures them. The operation therefore is natural, not magical or superstitious, as some may think. Bright coral restrains tempests of thunder and lightning, and defends us from the cruelty of savage monsters that are bred by the heavens contrary to the course of nature. For sometimes the stars pour out a seed, of which a monster is begotten. Now these monsters cannot be where corals are. The use of charms in medicine was a very ancient practice, and when once commenced, each succeeding charm became more ridiculous. Pyreus mentions an antidote against the sting of a scorpion. The patient was to sit on an ass with his face to the tail, for by this means the poison was transmitted from the man to the beast. Psamonicus, a poetical physician, recommended the 4th book of Homer's Iliad to be laid under the patient's head to cure a quartan ague. The efficacy of scriptural sentences was deduced from the custom of the Jews wearing phylacteries. An approved spell for sore eyes was worn as a jewel about many necks. It was written on paper and enclosed in silk, never failing to do sovereign good when all other helps were hopeless. No sight might dare to read it, but at length a curious mind, while the patient slept, by stealth ripped open the mystical cover, and found in Latin, Diabolus effodiat tibi oculis, empleat foramina stercoribus. When astrology was in repute, physic was generally practiced with some reference to the stars, and the astrological judgments became a very common object of inquiry amongst physicians. A Dr. Saunders, who wrote very fully on this branch of the science, thus commences, "From hence withdraw all carping critics that deny the great art of sublime astrology, which, unto such as have attained the key, shows the true cause of a disease, and may direct the doctor expeditiously the nearest way to cure the malady. But, says he, the firm and steadfast confidence in the Almighty is quite essential to the happy conclusion of all expectionates. For, if thou presumest otherwise, no doubt but that will be verified on thee, which the prophet saith to the Chaldeans, Sapientia et scientia te desepiat. For either by thy own ignorance and mistaking thou wilt be seduced, or else heaven itself shall yield unto thee so ambiguous an answer, that thou shalt not be able to conclude any certainty. The Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Arabians do observe many curious observations in this art, as translation of light, prohibition, contraradiation, restitution, frustration, obsession, cursivacation, cursitardation, virality, agadescension, meridiodescentia, luminiminution, numeriminution, via combusta, etc., which, although I wish not to deny to have some small effect, yet I have often proved that overmuch curiosity doth rather deviate a man from concluding anything certainly. If thou findest the cusp of the ascendant to fall in the very latter end of a sign, then doubtless the querent comes but to tempt thee. Or if the question be not radical, if the lord of the ascendant or the hour be not one of triplicity, it signifies the carelessness of the querent, and that he cares not whether you hit or miss. Among the more remarkable of subsequent medical delusions were the cure by sympathy, royal touch, and animal magnetism. Sounder views of medical practice were entertained by degrees, but enough of the old leaven of folly and superstition has, at different times, shown itself to prove that human nature will never be free from the imputation of lending itself, either from vanity, indolence, or ignorance, to forward the views of ridiculous or unprincipled empiricism, the disciples of which would, nevertheless, be the first to disbelieve or dispute similar assertions or arguments when applied to the exercise of other professions or trades. The first medical delusion which claims our notice is the cure by sympathy. What is now the common method of healing wounds appeared most unnatural to the surgeons at the end of the 17th century, and their legitimate and only cure proved such torture to the unhappy patients that in those days nothing was to be heard in the hospitals at the time of dressing but howling and cries. A man proposing the romantic doctrine of adhesion of wounds by union of their edges would have been despised. But if he were bold and cunning enough to give an air of incantation to his cures, or declare that they were performed by a secret philosophical sympathy, he was sure of success. No surgeon in Europe ventured to unite wounds directly, without pretending to have learnt from some Eastern sage, or to have discovered by abstruse studies in philosophy and alchemy a sympathetic or philosophical mode of cure. The first inventor of the sympathetic powder was the celebrated Paracelsus, and the Paracelsian doctors flourished in England when Dr. Charleston wrote his Ternary of Paradoxes, chiefly on the magnetic or attractive power of wounds. This fanaticism lasted no short time, and was hardly to be paralleled, except by the study of the perpetual elixir and the universal solvent. Sir Kenelm Digby, secretary to Charles I, was driven into exile during the civil wars. In a discourse upon the cure by sympathy, pronounced at Montpellier before an assembly of nobles and learned men, he gave the curious case of Mr. Howell, who, whilst endeavouring to part two of his friends who were fighting, had his hand cut to the bone. Sir Kenelm was applied to for assistance. "I told him," says he, "I would willingly serve him, but if haply he knew the manner how I would cure him, without touching or seeing him, it may be he would not expose himself to my manner of curing, because he would think it, peradventure, either ineffectual or superstitious." He replied, "The wonderful things which many have related unto me of your way of medicinement makes me nothing doubt at all of its efficacy, and all that I have to say unto you is comprehended in the Spanish proverb, Hágase el milagro y hágalo Mohammed. Let the miracle be done, though Mohammed do it." I asked him then for anything that had the blood upon it, so he presently sent for his garter, wherewith his hand was first bound, and dissolving some vitriol in a basin of water, I put in the garter, observing in the interim what Mr. Howell did. He suddenly started, as if he had found some strange alteration in himself. I asked him what he ailed. "I know not what ails me, but I find that I feel no more pain. Methinks that a pleasing kind of freshness, as it were a wet cold napkin, did spread over my hand, which hath taken away the inflammation that tormented me before." I replied, "Since then that you feel already so good effect of my medicament, I advise you to cast away all your plasters, only keep the wound clean, and in a moderate temper betwixt heat and cold." To be brief, there was no sense of pain afterward, but within 5 or 6 days the wounds were cicatrized and entirely healed. The king obtained from Sir Kenelm the discovery of his secret, which he pretended had been taught him by a Carmelite friar who had learned it in Armenia or Persia. The fact was, the sympathetical physician understood the cure of wounds by adhesion more perfectly than others, but it was necessary to cheat the world into this safe method of cure, and they declined the use of it altogether, where they foresaw, from the nature of the wound, it could not succeed. The public opinion would have been so strong against any open innovation that the sympathetic doctors got credit for something like witchcraft and condescended to dress axes and swords, that the wounds might have leave to lie at rest till they healed. All cures by adhesion were mysteriously performed, and one in particular called the secret dressing, in which great pains were taken before laying the lips of the wound together to suck out all the blood. This was chiefly used by drummers in regiments to conceal the quarrels of the soldiers. The trick of this way of cure consisted in making grimaces and contortions, signing their patients with the cross, and muttering between their teeth some unintelligible jargon. Their care was to keep the profession among themselves, and it was from the profanation of the sign of the cross that there arose a hot war between the priests and the suckers, the former refusing confession, extreme unction, or any sacrament to those who had undergone the magical or diabolical ceremonies of the suckers, who, on the other hand, refused to suck those connected in any way with the priests, being anxious to preserve their trade, which was not without its emoluments, for Verdict observes that they were still more skillful in sucking gold than blood. The vulnerary powder and tincture of the sulphur of Venus performed wonders, one of which Dr. Colbatch relates of a Mr. Poole, who was run through the body with a sword and lost 4 quarts of blood. The medicines being applied, the bleeding stopped. On the following day he was gnawing tough, ill-boiled mutton, and drank a quart of ale, and in the course of 5 days he returned to duty in the camp. A Mr. Cherry also, sergeant of grenadiers at the attack of the castle of Namur, was wounded in 26 places, 23 with bullets, and 3 large cuts on the head with a sword. He lay 48 hours stripped naked upon the breach, without a bit of bread or drop of drink, or anything done to his wounds. Yet this man was cured by the vulnerary powder and tincture alone, and never had any fever. The materials of the sympathetic powder were more heterogeneous and horrid than those which the witches used to drop into the cauldron. Human fat, human blood, mummy, the moss that grows in dead men's skulls, or hog's brains, and the chief schism among the great masters of the sympathetic school arose from the question whether it was necessary that the moss should grow absolutely in the skull of the thief who had hung on the gallows, and whether the medicine, while compounding, was to be stirred with a murderer's knife. Some, anxious to avoid the damnable charges which were urged against this practice, defended it on philosophical principles and from the analogy of other natural operations. Any lute, said they, being tuned in unison with another, is affected when the other is struck. The magnet turns by sympathy to the pole. Amber attracts light bodies. Bloodstones hung to the breast make us cheerful and merry, and the wearing of jewels secures chastity. All acknowledged sympathetic cures were successful, and the established surgeons of that day refused to practice the treatment only because it was impious and unlawful. For, said they, how can we contradict matters of fact? We come now to the second of the great medical delusions, that which attributed to the royal touch a sanative power in scrofulous cases. This is supposed to have been a monkish invention, to increase the reverence for kings, and was practiced in England and France. Becket, a writer in the time of Charles II, fully describes the royal gift of touching for the evil, which gift had been confirmed and continued for 640 years. It is proved out of Corinthians 1, chapter 12, verse 9, to another the gift of healing by the same Spirit, and they must needs be allowed no good subjects who dare deny this sanative faculty when so many thousands had received benefit. Clovis I, the 5th king of France, who reigned about 500 years after the birth of Christ, is reputed to have been the first who had the gift of curing this disease. William of Malmesbury states that Edward the Confessor was the first in England who healed strumous patients by the touch. Dr. Plott describes a piece of gold of this monarch found in St. Giles Fields near Oxford, having EC over the head, as well as 2 small holes through it by which it was hung on a riband, and used at the ceremony of touching for the evil. Some have considered this gift as the most efficacious part of the cure. Some imagine that the success was principally owing to the sign of the cross made on the swellings. The power of healing by the royal touch does not seem to have been very frequently practiced till the time of Charles I and II, after which it almost ceased. Mr. Evelyn gives a full description of the ceremony. His Majesty, says he, began to touch for the evil according to custom. Thus, His Majesty, sitting under his state in the banqueting house, the surgeons caused the sick to be brought or led up to the throne, where they kneeling, the king strokes their faces or cheeks with both his hands at once, at which instant a chaplain in his formalities says, he put his hands upon them and he healed them. This is said to everyone in particular. When they have all been touched, they come up again in the same order, and the other chaplain kneeling, and having angels of gold strung on white ribands on his arm, delivers them one by one to His Majesty, who puts them about the necks of the touched as they pass, whilst the first chaplain repeats, "That is the true light who came into the world." Then follows an epistle, with the liturgy and prayers for the sick, with some alteration. Lastly, the blessing. Then the Lord Chamberlain and Comptroller of the household bring a basin, ewer, and towel for His Majesty to wash. John Bird says, the king expresses his belief in the cure being effected through the grace of God, saying at the time of the ceremony, "I touch, God heals." One of the historians of the royal touch gives a numerical table of the number of persons touched by Charles II from May 1660 to 1680, distinguishing the exact number of each year. The grand total amounts to the incredible number of 92,107 at the average of 12 every day. Others, besides those of royal extraction, set up pretensions of curing certain diseases by touch. The seventh sons of seventh sons had a more than usual virtue inherent in them, but the one who attracted public attention most was Mr. Valentine Greatrackes, called par excellence the Stroker. He was an Irish gentleman and came to England, invited by the Earl of Orrery to cure the Viscountess Conway of an inveterate headache, and though he failed in that attempt, he is said to have wrought many surprising cures, not unlike miracles. He was born in 1628, seemed very religious, his looks grave but simple. He had felt a strange persuasion or impulse that he had the gift of curing the evil, which suggestion becoming very strong, he stroked several persons and cured them. During an epidemical fever, he cured all who came to him, his power of curing extending over diverse maladies. He performed such extraordinary cures that he was cited into the bishop's court at Lismore for not having a license to practice. He arrived in England in 1666, and as he proceeded through the country, magistrates of the cities and towns through which he passed begged him to come and cure their sick. Having arrived in London, he every day went to a particular part, where a prodigious number of sick of all ranks and both sexes assembled. His fame did not last, however. He returned to Ireland in 1667 and lived many years, but no longer kept up the reputation of performing strange cures. On the strictest inquiry, no sort of blemish was ever thrown on his character. End of Chapter 19, Part 1. Chapter 19 of Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by docdlmartin. Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport. Medical Delusions and Frauds, Part 2. A Mr. Morley wrote on the virtues of the vervain root as an effectual cure for scrofula. I recommend, says he, a piece of the root of common purple vervain, fresh, about 3 or 4 inches long, all the fibers to be cut off, and it is to be always worn at the pit of the stomach, tied with 1 yard of white satin riband, ½ inch wide. No other color is proper, because the dye may be prejudicial. It is the fate of all useful discoveries or improvements to meet with bigoted or interested opposition from those who would willingly remain in the beaten path of habit rather than acknowledge any change to be profitable. That most important discovery of the circulation of the blood by Harvey was at first furiously opposed, and was proved, according to the laws of hydraulics, to be both impossible and absurd. Yet, when it was in vain to dispute the fact, it was undervalued as one almost known long before. Inoculation, it is well known, as a means of rendering smallpox less severe, was introduced into England by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who had frequent opportunities of seeing the operation performed when residing at Constantinople with her husband, the English ambassador there. She was so thoroughly convinced of the safety of this practice that she was resolved to submit her only son to it, a boy about 6 years of age. The operation succeeded perfectly. This happened in 1717. After her return to England, she set the first and great example by having her little girl, then 5 years old, also inoculated. Mr. C. Maitland, who had accompanied the family of Mr. Wortley and had inoculated the son and daughter of that gentleman, performed the operation by royal command on 6 condemned criminals at Newgate, in the presence of several eminent physicians and surgeons, and they all did well. Mr. Maitland, however, was not prepared to find this species infectious, and was much surprised to find that the disorder was caught by 6 servants, who were wont to hug and caress a little child, sick of the inoculated disease. So great a novelty as the inoculation of a disease produced much astonishment and dread, and it was opposed professionally and theologically. Mr. Edmund Massey preached a sermon at St. Andrew's, Holborn, July 8, 1722, against the dangerous and sinful practice of inoculation. His text was Job, chapter 2, verse 7. So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils, from the sole of his foot unto his crown. From this text he argued that the disease with which Job was smitten was neither more nor less than the confluent smallpox. With this view I shall not, said he, scruple to call it a diabolical operation, usurping an authority founded neither in nature nor religion. This practice also tends to promote vice and immorality, inasmuch as it diminishes the salutary terror which prevails respecting the uncertain approach of the disease. Inoculation has doubtless been of infinite benefit to society, but it is now superseded by a much greater improvement, namely that of vaccination. This is, beyond all comparison, the most valuable and the most important discovery ever made. It strikes out one of the worst in the catalogue of human evils. It annihilates a disease which has ever been considered as the most dreadful scourge of mankind. Dr. Edward Jenner, the inventor of vaccination, was born in Gloucestershire in 1749, and being educated for the medical profession, was placed under the immediate tuition of Mr. John Hunter, with whom he lived 2 years as a house pupil. After finishing his studies in London, he settled at Berkeley. His inquiry into the nature of cowpox commenced about the year 1776. His attention to this singular disease was first excited by observing that among those whom he inoculated for the smallpox many were insusceptible of that disorder. These persons, he was informed, had undergone the casual cowpox, which had been known in the dairies from time immemorial, and a vague opinion prevailed that it was a preventive of the smallpox. He instituted a series of experiments, and several persons were successively inoculated from each other with vaccine matter and then exposed to the infection of smallpox, which they all resisted. When these facts were communicated to the world, envy assailed his fame. His discovery was depreciated, then denied. Truth, however, ultimately prevailed. Vaccination obtained a complete triumph, and the foes of Jenner and humanity were covered with confusion. Dr. Moseley, one of his opponents, asks if any person can say, what may be the consequences of introducing a bestial humor into the human frame after a long lapse of years? He was asked in return, what may be the consequences after a long lapse of years of introducing into the human frame cow's milk, beefsteaks, or a mutton chop? Dr. Jenner had numerous presents of plate, etc. Honors were conferred on him by different societies, and a grant of £10,000 was voted to him by Parliament. The phenomena of animal magnetism, when announced to the world, excited the greatest sensation on the continent, particularly in France. For some years the subject filled their journals and mercuries and employed some of their best pens and brightest wits. M. Mesmer, the inventor, was a native of Switzerland, of great talents but enthusiastic fancy. He undertook to defend the old doctrine of the influence of the planets on the human frame, and he searched for some means of communication between them. Electricity did not answer his expectations, and he turned his attention to magnetism. Iron becomes magnetic after being rubbed with a magnet. He therefore rubbed the human body with a lodestone. The phenomenon which resulted he attributed at first to the magnetic influence, but experience proved to him that the application of the bare hand produced the same effect, yet he called this animal magnetism. M. Lowe, a supporter, says, on a certain application of the palm of the hand and tips of the fingers made by the magnetizer, without, however, touching the person, or even at the distance of 2 or 3 inches, the magnetized individual feels an increase of warmth, at times a chilliness or uneasiness within him, particularly near the pit of the stomach. After repeated applications, the eyelids become heavy, and the patient falls into a sleep from which he cannot be aroused by sense of hearing or by any other of the external organs of sense. There was one instance of a magnetized person who had only occasion to enter the house of the magnetizer in order to fall into a profound and magnetical sleep. A very rare result of this state is that of clairvoyance, when it has been observed that the internal sense seems to present itself wholly unconfined, and all nature appears to be disclosed to it, the body being, as it were, completely numbed, eyelids open, pulse soft and hardly perceptible. The countenance is transformed and exhibits the picture of innocence. They are in fervent prayer to the Creator, or perhaps they describe scenes and pastimes at the Antipodes. A female who had never been in America and had never read geographical descriptions described that continent, its inhabitants, etc., very accurately. Meeting with but little encouragement in Germany, Mesmer went to France, where he was exceedingly successful. His cures were numerous and of the most astonishing nature. He was obliged to form a number of pupils under his inspection to administer his process. His house at Créteil was crowded with patients, and a numerous company was daily assembled at his house at Paris, where the operation was publicly performed. One evening, M. Mesmer walked with 6 persons in the gardens of the Prince de Soubise. He performed a magnetical operation upon a tree, and a little after 3 ladies of the company fainted away. The Duchess, the only remaining lady, supported herself upon the tree without being able to quit it. The Count of unable to stand, was obliged to throw himself upon a bench. The effects upon M.A., a gentleman of muscular frame, were more terrible, and M. Mesmer's servant, who was summoned to remove the bodies, and who was inured to these scenes, found himself unable to move. The whole company were obliged to remain in this situation for a considerable time. The public method of magnetizing was performed in a large room, in the center of which stood a circular box, large enough to admit of 50 persons standing round it. Out of the lid came numerous branches of iron, one to each patient. The patients applied this branch to the part affected, and a cord passed round their bodies, connected one with the other, and each patient pinched the thumb of his neighbor. A pianoforte played different airs with various rapidity, the sound of which was also a conductor of magnetism. The bucket in the center was the grand reservoir, from which the fluid was diffused through the branches of iron inserted in the lid. All this was purely imaginary, for, on being tested with an electrometer and needle of iron, it was evident the bucket contained no substance either electric or magnetical. By degrees, however, the several ranks of patients round the bucket became affected with drowsiness, convulsions, or hysterics, and nothing was more astonishing than the combination of effects at one view. The patients appeared entirely under the government of the person who distributed the magnetic virtue. This system at length was thought to deserve the attention of government, and a committee, partly physicians and partly members of the Royal Academy of Sciences, with Dr. Benjamin Franklin at their head, were appointed to examine it. M. Mesmer refused communication with them, but M. Deslon, the most considerable of his pupils, consented to disclose to them his principles. The result of the investigation was made known by a report from the commissioners. They decided that, instead of being a novelty, Mesmer's was merely an ancient and worthless system, which had long been abandoned by the learned. The commissioners afterwards made experiments on single subjects and upon themselves. After repeated experiments, not one of the commissioners felt any sensation that could be ascribed to the action of magnetism. Of 14 sick persons operated upon in private, 5 only appeared to feel any effect from the operation. In fact, magnetism did not appear to them to have any existence for those subjects who submitted to it with any degree of incredulity. M. Segon, by pretending to possess the magnetizing power, had all the success of Mesmer himself. He detailed in a letter to the commissioners the results as follows. The magisterial tone and serious air I affected, together with certain gestures, made a very great impression on the woman of the house, which she was desirous to conceal, but having guided my hand upon the region of the heart, I felt it palpitate. Her face became convulsed, her eyes wandered. She at length fell into a swoon, and was reduced to a state of weakness and sinking perfectly incredible. I repeated the same trick upon others, and succeeded more or less, according to their different degrees of sensibility and credulity. A celebrated artist complained for several days of an extreme headache, and acquainted me with it on the Pont Royal. Having persuaded him that I was initiated in the mysteries of mesmerism, I expelled his headache almost instantaneously by means of a few gestures, to his great astonishment. From numerous experiments made by the commissioners, it was quite clear that those who were most susceptible of the magnetic influence, if magnetized unknown to themselves, were not in the least affected, whereas when they suspected the operation was performing, they exhibited all the usual phenomena attributed to that power, though in reality nothing was done. Metallic tractors, as the agents of animal magnetism under the superintendence of Dr. Perkins, for a time produced a sensation equally extraordinary in England, but it was satisfactorily proved that the imagination of the patient alone gave virtue to the tractors. Dr. Thornton found a wooden skewer had all the power of the tractors in removing pain when clandestinely used instead of them. The Baron Silverkilm of Uliatag in Finland was a great proficient in mesmerism. He imagined the souls of those magnetically asleep were translated to the regions above, where the souls of the departed were all dressed in white robes and enjoyed constant scenes of delight. He would interrogate the sleepers concerning the white robes, paradise, and the Elysian fields. He was also desirous to receive intelligence from his ancestors, and in general, they very kindly sent him their compliments by the mouths of the couriers in white jackets. By directly attacking the imagination did Mr. Luderberg cure vast numbers of patients. He became impressed with the idea that he had a commission from above to cure diseases, and his door was soon crowded with patients all day. Amongst others, a respectable man from the country had been afflicted with great pains and swellings, particularly about the loins, so that he could not walk across the room. On entering, Mr. Luderberg looked steadfastly at him and said, "I know your complaint, sir. Look at me." They continued looking at each other some minutes. Then Mr. L. asked if he did not feel some warmth at his loins. The man replied that he did. "Then you will feel in a few minutes much greater warmth." After a short pause, the man said, "I feel as if a person was pouring boiling water upon me." Still looking him in the face, Mr. L. said, "How did you come here, sir?" "In a coach." "Then go and discharge your coach and walk back to town." From Hammersmith Terrace, where Mr. L. resided, the coach was discharged and the patient walked to town, and next day he walked 5 hours about town without fatigue. He offered £10, but Mr. L. would not take a farthing. The easy manner in which people have become a prey to illiterate and dangerous pretenders in the medical art has been long known. Many thousand volumes would attest the truth of this observation, which has been often repeated. Cotta in 1612 says, "There is no place or person ignorant how all sorts of vile people and unskilful persons, without restraint, make gainful traffic by botching in physic, and hereby numbers of unwanting innocents daily enthrall and betray themselves to sustain the riot of their enemies and common homicides." The late Dr. Buchan exclaimed, "As matters stand at present, it is easier to cheat a man out of his life than a shilling, and almost impossible to detect or punish the offender. The case is still the same." Uroscopy, or water casting, was once very much practiced, and those who professed to cure diseases by such inspection simply were consulted by all classes of persons. The absurdity of these pretensions was forcibly exposed by Dr. Radcliffe on the following occasion. A shoemaker's wife applied to him to relieve her husband, who was very ill, presenting him with a vial of his water for inspection. The doctor exchanged the contents and bade her take that back and tell her husband to make a pair of shoes by the same instructions. A Dr. Meyersbach started about 1770 as a water doctor. He had arrived from Germany in a starving state and was first an ostler at a riding school. Not making money fast enough, he set up as a doctor and was consulted by all classes. Dr. Letzam took great pains to expose the ignorance and knavery of Meyersbach, whose violent medicines, if they sometimes cured, more often aggravated his patients' sufferings. It is believed that he acquired a good fortune, with which he retired to his native country. Lefebvre, another German, a broken wine merchant, set up for a gout doctor, and was much noticed by the nobility. Under pretense of going to Germany for more of his powders, he quitted this country, and had the prudence never to return. He carried over above 10,000 guineas, obtained by subscription and otherwise, Living in the style of a prince, he drank daily as his first toast to the credulous and stupid nobility, gentry, and opulent merchants of Great Britain. Calculus disorders are so painful in general that people suffering from such causes eagerly fly to what promises relief. Many specifics for this disease, lycanthropics, as they were called, had their day. In 1771, a Dr. Chittick advertised such a remedy and made use of a very unusual expedient to keep it secret. He would not entrust it to anyone unmixed. The vehicle in which it was to be taken was weak veal broth, which was sent from him day to day. Each of his patients sent him 3 pints of broth in a tin bottle, padlocked to prevent curious persons from prying, the doctor and patient each having a key. His terms were 2 guineas a week, regularly paid, besides which he expected a considerable premium for his pains. Mr. Blackery, who exposed this species of fraud, detected by analysis a solution of alkaline salts and quicklime, yet the doctor greatly exclaimed against the use of those salts as highly mischievous. A Mrs. Joanna Stevens was the proprietor of a lycanthropic, which for a long time had a great repute, and was even thought worthy the attention of Parliament, who voted for £5,000 for making known the composition of it, a favourable report of its efficacy having been given by the gentlemen who were appointed trustees to examine into its pretensions. Subsequent experience has shown that it is not so well adapted to the ends proposed, being a medley of soap and ill-prepared alkaline substances, very nauseous and oppressive to the stomach. The recent and valuable discovery of lithotrity, now practiced by Baron Horteloup and others, namely, the application of mechanical power for the destruction of the stone, without the use of the knife, is likely to be of more signal advantage than internal remedies, and though it is candidly stated by its supporters not to be applicable in every case, yet it may frequently be performed without either pain or inconvenience. The anodyne necklace, which was the result of some ridiculous superstition respecting the efficacy of Sir Hugh's bones, is still gravely offered for sale to facilitate the cutting of the teeth. In 1717, a philosophical treatise was published wherein it says, "The effluvia and atoms driven off by the heat of the body bear such a tendency to the ailing part as the lodestone does to iron, and that they will never leave off acting till they have given ease, and consequently it is a thing most capable of curing sympathetically the diseases of a human body of anything in the whole world." Since this famed necklace has been published, the bills of mortality have so decreased as to be less than ever they have been known to be. But the summum bonum with which this series of medical deceptions may appropriately be closed was the universal medicine or virtues of the magnetical antimonial cup, addressed to the Houses of Parliament by John Evans, minister and preacher of God's word. It is warranted to be alone the phoenix and miracle of all physical miracles, the elixir of life, balsam of nature. It containeth mystically and essentially the quintessence of all minerals and vegetables, and magnetically sympathizeth with all animals. In spite, however, of such admirable, never-failing specific, which it would seem ought to have exterminated every malady from the face of the earth, diseases, hydra-headed, still baffle their assailants and return to the charge with renewed force and provoking obstinacy. But the matter is too serious for the subject of a joke. If even practitioners who have conscientiously studied their profession are unavoidably in some degree open to the old charge of pouring medicines of which they know little into a body of which they know less, what must be said, or what ought to be the punishment, of such villainous pretenders as those who have been described in this chapter, men without talent or education, and who seem to think that, like charity, impudence covers a multitude of sins. End of chapter 19, part 2.
Chapter 26 of Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport. Concluding chapter, Miscellaneous. Superstition of the Hindus, the Malays, Asiatic superstitions, the Chinese, miracle of the Blessed Virgin, stratagem of an architect, Michelangelo's Cupid, statue of Charles I, ever-burning sepulchral lamps, lamp in the tomb of Pallas, the art of mimicry, superiority of the ancients, fable of Proteus, personation of the insane Ajax, Archimedes at funerals, Demetrius the cynic converted, acting portraits and historical pictures, war dances of the American Indians, the South Sea Bubble, Gay the poet, Law's Mississippi Scheme, numerous bubbles, speculations in 1825. Such has been the extent of the credulity of the human mind, that it would require many volumes to enumerate the whole of its singular vagaries. Our object in compiling such a work cannot be accomplished without greatly condensing those accounts which historians and travelers have communicated. We therefore devote the concluding chapter to summary notices of several matters that, to enlarge upon, would defeat the intent of this publication. The religion of India is based upon the grossest superstition. Divided into castes, the persons of the Brahmins are sacred. The food of the Hindus is entirely of vegetables, as it was in the time of Alexander. Widows were burned alive to ensure their eternal happiness. 150,000 persons assemble yearly at the temple of Juggling in honor of a blind deity, precipitating themselves voluntarily before its wheels, where they are crushed to death, thus instantly, as they believe, entering a blessed immortality. More individual cases of absurd and disgusting fanaticism occur in the Hindu religion than, probably, in all the other religions in the world. The excruciating penances these Indian devotees voluntarily undergo, their number and extent, have struck all travelers. In making a pilgrimage to Herdmar, one zealous devotee performed a journey of some 100 miles, prostrating himself and measuring every inch of the way with his body as he advanced. Some swing themselves on a rope by means of a hook passed through the muscles of the back. Some over fires with their heads towards the flame. Every variety of personal torture is endured from a mistaken principle of religion, conjoined with pride of caste. Some have literally burned themselves alive. Mutilation to propitiate some goddess is no uncommon occurrence. Some years since a Hindu actually cut out his tongue to propitiate the amiable goddess Kali Ghat. The Malays have equally absurd superstitions and charms are bought at extravagant prices. A volume alone would be required to cite the superstitions of Asia, where the human mind remains to this day in a childlike state. The peculiar tenets of the Chinese have been ably set forth by many writers, and by none more successfully than by Davis, in his history of this curious nation. Their priests are taken from the lowest orders, and a Chinaman depends upon their prayers. But we need not visit China to be convinced of the natural tendency of man to superstition. A story is current of a picture of the Immaculate Conception, which was in the late College of Jesuits in Valencia, that may challenge competition for absurdity. This picture is the object of general veneration, and by the devout is considered almost equal to the Virgin herself, for tradition reports that it was painted of Father Alberto, to whom the Blessed Virgin condescended to appear on the eve of the Assumption, ordering her portrait in the dress she then wore. he employed wands, who, after many trials succeeding, the work was sanctified, and the pencil, like a sword, was blessed and made invincible by the Pope, so that it never missed its stroke. One day wands, seated on a scaffold at work in the upper part of the picture, the painter being in the act of falling, the holy personage whose portrait he had finished stepped suddenly from the canvas, and seizing his hand, preserved him from the fall, when the gracious lady returned to her post. A very ancient fraud connected with architecture is mentioned by Sandys in his curious and rare book on the East. One of the Ptolemies caused a tower to be built of a wonderful height, having many lanterns for the use of ships at sea during the night. It was reputed the seventh wonder of the world. Sostratus of Cnidus, the ambitious architect, was refused by the king the satisfaction of setting his name to the work. This, however, the artist effected by cutting an inscription on a block of marble, which he encrusted over with a fictitious stone, on which was engraved a pompous inscription in honor of the king. When it decayed, his own name appeared as the builder. Michelangelo, to try how far he could impose upon the curious in sculpture, carved a statue of Cupid. Having broken off the arm, he buried the rest of the figure under a certain ruin, where they were wont to dig in search of marbles. It was soon after discovered, and passed among the learned antiquaries for an invaluable and undoubted piece of ancient sculpture, till Angelo produced the arm previously broken off, which fitted so exactly as to convince them of their too easy credulity and the vanity of their speculations. In the year 1678 was erected the animated statue of Charles I at Charing Cross. The Parliament in Cromwell's time ordered it to be sold and broken to pieces, but the Regier who purchased it dug a hole in his garden and buried it unmutilated, producing to his masters several pieces of brass which he told them were parts of the statue, and in the true spirit of trade he cast a number of handles of knives and forks, offering them for sale as composed of the brass of the statue. They were eagerly sought for and purchased by the Loyalists from affection for their murdered monarch. When the second Charles was restored, the statue was brought forth from its place of concealment and eagerly purchased at a great profit to the brazier. A superstition now forgotten was long credited that sepulchral lamps had burned for several hundred years, and that they would have continued burning perhaps forever, had they not been broken by the accidental digging into the tombs by husbandmen and others. Few have declared themselves to have been eyewitnesses of the fact, but many learned and ingenious authors give abundance of instances on the reports of others. The origin of these lamps seems to have been with the Egyptians, who, through a firm belief of the metempsychosis, endeavored to procure a perpetuity to the body itself by balsams or embalming, and security to it afterwards by lodging it in pyramids or catacombs. So also they endeavored to animate the defunct by perpetual fire, the essence of which answered the nature of the soul in their opinion. For with them, fire was the symbol of the incorruptible, immortal, and divine nature. The soul was to be lighted by its lamp when it wandered according to its option, and thus safely returned to its old quarters. One of the most remarkable of the sepulchral lamps has thus been described as found in the tomb of Pallas. In the year 1501, a countryman, digging deep into the earth near Rome, discovered a tomb of stone wherein lay a body so tall that being raised erect, it overtopped the walls of the city, and was as entire as if newly buried, having a very large wound on the breast, and a lamp burning at the head, which could neither be extinguished by wind nor water, so that they were obliged to perforate the bottom of the lamp, and by that means put out the flame. This was said to be the body of Pallas, slain by Turnus, The lamp is said to have burned 2,511 years, and perhaps would have continued to burn to the end of the world had it not been broken and the liquid spilt. At the present day of intellectual advancement, this story of the size of Pallas, and of the lamp whose contumacious flame, well befitting such a giant, exceeds all belief, however gravely stated. Yet the time was when, instead of exciting contemptuous laughter, it was implicitly credited. The lamp in the temple of Jupiter Ammon was reported by the priest to have burned continually, yet it consumed less oil each succeeding year, though burning in the open air. Neither wind nor water could extinguish it. A similar lamp also burned in honor of Venus. Trithemius obliges his readers with 2 long receipts for the artificial manufacture of these lamps, yet seems to doubt their efficacy. The possibility of such eternal lamps being made in Egypt has been attributed to the existence of the bituminous wells or fountains, from which the learned in those days laid secret canals or pipes to the subterranean caves, where, in a convenient place, they set up a lamp with a wick of asbestos. It seems, indeed, to have been thought a great desideratum in the arts to invent a perpetual lamp for the companion of the dead as a complementary illumination to the manes of the departed, or from some foolish desire to strike wonder in after times in some carnal beholder unwittingly violating the tomb. The accounts of such appear to have been generally believed authentic up to the end of the 17th century. The utilitarian age we live in is content to possess a perpetual locomotive fire for those above ground. The art of mimicry, in its modern sense, though confined to a mere imitation of manners, in former times, by the excellence of its action, imposed on the imaginations of the spectators and persuaded them into a belief of the reality of what was represented, even as it were against conviction. The endeavor of one or more individuals to express or relate any story by mere action was carried to much greater perfection among the ancients than now appears to be possible. According to Lucian, a single dancer or mime was able to express all the incidents and sentiments of a whole tragedy or epic, poem by action, accompanied by music, and the fable of Proteus he seemed to think meant no more than that he was an accomplished pantomime. The education of a mime required, he says, his whole life to make himself master of his profession. He must know the past, the present, and what is to come. In short, the spectator must understand the dancer, though dumb, and hear him, though silent. Lucian mentions a famous mime who played Ajax the madman so well, and raged in such a way that one would have said he did not counterfeit, but was mad in reality. Timocrates, a tutor in philosophy, and who, from conscientious motives, had declined being present at such plays, by accident seeing a pantomime, cried out, "What admirable sights have I lost by a philosophical modesty," and ever afterwards attended them. The kind of scenic representation was given at funerals, and the actors were called archimimes. They went before the coffin and imitated the gestures and actions of the deceased. His virtues and vices were depicted. Demetrius, the cynic, disdained and railed at the art of the mime, declaring all the success was derived from the music. But a famous mime in Nero's time invited him to see him dance, and having witnessed his performance, then to find fault with him. Having imposed silence on the music, he danced the story of the amours of Mars and Venus, the discovery of them by the sun. In short, so well was it done that Demetrius, transported, cried out aloud, "I hear, my friend, what you act. I not only see the persons you represent, but methinks you speak with your hands." There is less to be said of this art in its present state, though pantomime, considered distinct from harlequinade, now receives great attention in Italy. the acting of portraits and historical pictures, exhibited with the greatest fidelity of costume and attitude in Florence, and which amusement is now common in well-bred circles at home, is another species of ingenious deception, which is almost perfect. The war dance among the American Indians is most striking, representing a campaign. The departure of the warriors from their village, their march into the enemy's country, the caution with which they encamp, the address with which they station some of their company in ambuscade, the manner of surprising their enemy, the noise and ferocity of the combat, the scalping of those who are slain, the seizing of the prisoners, the triumphant return of the conquerors, and the torture of the victims, are successively and ably exhibited with the tact of actors. The performers enter with such enthusiastic ardor into their several parts. Their gestures, their countenance, their voice are so wild and so well adapted to their various situations that Europeans can hardly believe it to be a mimic scene or view it without emotions of horror. Public credulity, founded on the inordinate desire of gain, was perhaps never exhibited in a stronger point of view than by the fatal belief in the South Sea scheme, which was to the credulous believer like that of Law's Mississippi bubble, was made to appear a royal road to El Dorado. It was patronized by persons of both sexes in the highest ranks of society, and even by royalty itself and men of letters. Gay, the poet, had a present of some of the stock, and at one time believed himself worth £20,000, but like others lost all. Chandler, the learned nonconformist divine, lost his whole fortune and turned bookseller for subsistence. The scheme originated in the reign of Queen Anne in the year 1711, a fund being formed on the chimerical notion that the English would be allowed to trade to the coast of Peru. Sir John Blunt, who was bred a scrivener, devised the scheme and communicated it to A's Levy, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The pretense of his scheme was to discharge the national debt by reducing all the funds into one stock. The Bank of England and the South Sea Company vied with each other, and the latter ultimately offered such high terms that the proposal of the bank was rejected, and the company's stock rose considerably. It produced a kind of national delirium. Sir John Blunt took this hint from Law's scheme, which was that a royal bank be erected by subscription, and, having a fund in hand to answer bills on demand, the scheme began to take, and established its credit by its punctual discharge, till it increased to such extraordinary magnitude as to pay bills for £1,250,000 sterling a day. In this project of law, however, there was something substantial. An exclusive trade to Louisiana promised advantage, though the design was defeated by the frantic eagerness of the people. Law himself had become the dupe of the regent, who transferred the burden of 1,500 million of francs of the king's debt to the shoulders of the people, while the projector was sacrificed as the scapegoat of political iniquity. The South Sea scheme promised no commercial advantage of any consequence. It was buoyed by nothing but the folly and rapacity of individuals, who became so blinded with the prospect of gain as to become easy dupes. When the projector found that the South Sea stock did not rise to his expectation, he circulated reports that Gibraltar and Port Mahon would be exchanged for some places in Peru, by which the South Sea trade would be protected and enlarged. This report acted like a contagion. Persons of all ranks crowded to subscribe. The exchange alley was filled with a strange concourse of statesmen, clergymen, dissenters, Whigs, Tories, physicians, lawyers, etc., etc., and even females. All other professions and employments were neglected. Other companies without foundation were got up to deceive, and all found favor with the mad public. There were actually some shares of a fictitious company called Globe Permits, each of which came at last to be currently sold for 60 guineas and upwards, and yet were only square bits of card, on which were the impression of a seal in wax, having the sign of the Glove Tavern. A burlesque upon this reigning folly appeared in an advertisement for a company with a capital of 2 millions for melting down sawdust and chips and casting them into clean deal boards without knots. The public infatuation lasted till the 8th of September, when the stock began to fall and soon reached the point of being worthless. Public credit received a severe shock. The cunning ones devised a scheme for relief from the Bank of England and sold out for what they could realize. Some of the ministry were implicated. Knight, the treasurer, fled the kingdom. The committee of the House of Commons to investigate discovered a train of the deepest villainy. The directors were seized, and it appeared that large sums had been given to persons in the administration and House of Commons for promoting the passing of the Act, and a fictitious stock of £574,000 had been disposed of by the directors to facilitate the passage of the bill. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was committed to the Tower and convicted of peculation. The estates of the most guilty directors were confiscated for the benefit of the sufferers. In 1825, the general feeling for bubbles was again led captive by the unreasonable hopes of speculation. In January of that year, there existed in London no less than 120 speculating schemes, carried on by companies, often consisting of only the projector and his clerk, causing great misery and frequent ruin. The end. End of chapter 26. End of Sketches of Imposture, Deception, and Credulity by Richard Alfred Davenport.